Hey, this is the franchise Shane Douglas in the city that made me, well, maybe the city that I made famous, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Getting ready to do the sit-down a Legends interview on Hannibal TV, and what better place than right in front of the original ECW hotel, the Days Inn at the Philadelphia airport. It all started there and at the ECW arena, and right now you're ready to hear it all on Hannibal TV. Yeah!
What was your childhood like growing up, and where did you grow up?
I grew up in Pittsburgh. Well, I always say Pittsburgh, but it's about a mile, 30 miles northwest, I guess, of Pittsburgh. Little town called New Brighton, Pennsylvania. Wasn't a lot to do there. We, of course, like any kids in the States or any high school, I'm sure the same in Canada, grew up playing sports. If it wasn't organized sports, after school we were, whatever the season was, we were playing football season, we were playing football, baseball season, basketball. We were always doing something around. I grew up in a neighborhood that about 30 kids the same age, year or two, three apart. So there was always enough kids to get a football game, a baseball game, a basketball game together. And we all grew up watching wrestling. In Pittsburgh, the Steelers, of course, were great. The Pirates had just come off a few years before a World Series and would win one in a few more years in '79. And then the hockey players, as you guys in Canada, the big hockey area, the Penguins hadn't yet reached great. They hadn't yet gone to the black and gold and reached greatness. They were still a pretty low-level team and got beat up pretty often. So we had the Steelers and we had the Pirates and we had Bruno Sammartino in Pittsburgh with studio wrestling on Saturday nights. My friends and I, we all grew up, very, I wouldn't say poor. We were fed and, we were certainly low income. But we didn't know it. We were on the run all the time. I look back on my childhood as having a Norman Rockwell childhood. Had lots of friends to play with, had a loving mother and father, although they were divorced. I'd spend the weekends with my dad, my sister and I, and the rest of the week with my mother. And professional wrestling, and it was a big part of that. We grew up reading comic books and went from comic books to wrestling magazines. And this, to show you my age, this all precedes cable television in Pittsburgh. So we could read about the NWA and we could read about these, these Dusty Rhodes, Superstar Billy Graham matches and the bull rope matches in Madison Square Garden, but we never saw the video of it. And of course, there was no such thing as YouTube or online streaming. So we read about it in the magazines, and your imagination would take off. You could you run this movie in your head of what this match must look like. And in 1976, cable television finally came to the area. And my dad was the first to have it, and I went over to my dad's house that weekend. Saturday night, my dad had the TV guide and saw that WWF Wrestling was on midnight, the WOR show. So my dad worked on the railroad, and I had no idea. I loved professional wrestling. And he said, "Oh, there's wrestling on tonight. Let's watch wrestling." Because he was always gone on the weekends. He'd come and go with working on the railroad. And he was home that night, and we sat down. I remember he laid on the couch, and I sat on the floor on the couch in front of him. And the very first segment was Superstar Billy Graham with the Grand Wizard behind a cage talking about his upcoming cage match with Bruno Sammartino. He had a cabbage and shredded it on the cage. And I remember as a 13-year-old kid watching that, and this guy with this incredible muscles and tan and blonde hair and the gift of gab, and it was like a comic book come to life. I was just like a hook on a fish on the end of a hook. I thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever laid eyes on, and I've been a big fan ever since.
And you did amateur wrestling too, is that correct?
I did. I wrestled. My high school, New Brighton High School, didn't have a wrestling team. Wrestling hadn't yet come. There were a few schools in the area. Ambridge, which is 4 or 5 towns up from me, had it. I think Center may have had it. There were a handful of schools that did have a wrestling program. New Brighton did not. When I was about 5 years old, my mother took me to a club out in Warren, Ohio, which is a pretty good drive, and about an hour drive, 45-minute drive. And I would go out there a couple times per month and wrestle, and I'd wrestled through amateur up until about the time I was in high school.
What led to you eventually becoming a professional wrestler? It was more difficult in those days, I assume.
Yeah, well, there was no way of making contact. We didn't know. I knew Bruno Sammartino lived in Pittsburgh. I would have had no idea how to contact him, or even if I had the balls to contact him if I did know how. My friends and I, we were pretty handy, and we had picked up a Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine, and a kid had gotten his picture in the magazine. He had built a homemade ring, and it was a really sorry looking thing. I mean, it had strings hanging, like the ropes were sagging, and like an old carpet rolled over it. And we were all pretty handy and thought we can build a better ring than that. So we set out to start doing it. We went to the junkyard and found a big long, what turned out to be aluminum, like 30-foot pipe on the side of a tanker, cut it down and cleaned it up, made these boxes with these plates that had big bolts coming up out of them that we could screw the corner post to, and then we set down crates, and then had plywood that we put carpet padding, and then my brother had just come home from the Navy and had Naugahyde, imitation leather. We put those over it. So we had sort of a pieced together wrestling ring. And after we built that was the summer of 1978. After we built it and rolled around in a couple of weeks, we sort of got bored with it and thought, now what are we going to do with it? And at that time, Muscular Dystrophy used to have the Labor Day telethon where we would raise money. And they used to ask kids to do backyard carnivals, games and stuff, raise $5-10 and send it into Muscular Dystrophy. I came up with the idea of let's have a backyard wrestling show. So all you backyarders out there, I was years and years before you. We went to meet a woman named Angeline Paparella, and I'll never forget her name, and the reason for that is she was a nurse. I'm going to say she was probably in her 50s, give or take. She had been a nurse all of her professional life, and she had contracted adult onset muscular dystrophy. So when we went to meet her about setting this up, she was completely immobile. She was in a wheelchair that had a headrest, and the only thing she could move was a couple fingers. She was completely immobile. The rest she had rest for her arms. And this woman, the reason I remember her name is not because she was my connection to wrestling, but because to see how hard this woman in this state worked, how courageously she worked to defeat muscular dystrophy was stunning. Stuck with me today and will for the rest of my life, just how courageous this woman was. And I'm sure in hindsight she didn't say it at the time, but I'm guessing that having a bunch of snot-nosed 7th and 8th graders walking in and telling her we wanted to put on this wrestling show, she must have been taken back by that. And she called me up about a week later and she said, there's a professional wrestler that lives locally. He's an Italian guy. And of course I said, Bruno Sammartino. She said, no, it's not Bruno. And then she started fumbling over the name. She said, it's something like Donanini, and she's fumbling like that. And I said, Dominic DeNucci. At the time, he was World Tag Team Champion in the WWF with Dino Bravo. And she said, that's it, Dominic DeNucci. Well, you can imagine as a 13, 14-year-old kid, the World Tag Champion. And she gave me his phone number after getting permission to give it. I called and spoke to his wife, Janine, who had just sadly passed away last fall. And she told me that Dominic was on the road and that he was due to be back on whatever day. And a friend of mine drove me out, and he had not gotten home that day. So she said, I'll leave him the message, and when the show is, and she said, if he's in town, he doesn't think he's going to be, but if he's in town, he'll be stopping by. So we didn't even advertise. We told a few people, but we didn't advertise that Dominic DeNucci would be there because we weren't sure he'd show up. We said they had a beautiful Saturday afternoon, beautiful sunny day, and we set the ring up. And the ring, because of the sun, was like you could have literally fried eggs on it. It was really not a ring I'd wrestle in today. But we ended up drawing about 75 people. We made, I think it was like $253 or something. And about halfway through the show, this big white LTD pulled up in the parking lot in the business next door. We had set up behind my one friend's father owned a bar, and we were set up in the back area, and this big LTD pulled in, and I can still in my head see the door opening and just see this huge barrel get out. It's this massive man get out of the car and stands up, and as soon as he stood up, we knew it was Dominic. So I ran over to introduce myself to him, and he came over and started, you could tell, just taking it in and, like sort of taken back by all of it. And he ended up getting involved, like he saw us doing the matches, and, for not knowing what we were doing, we did a pretty good job. The way we did it then is much like the kids in indie wrestling do today. We just scripted out a match. We'll walk up and do this and then this, and then we practiced those over and over and over and over again, and we just went out and did what we had practiced. And after the show, my brother-in-law, who was taking pictures from rooftops and things, had a lot of really cool pictures, different perspectives, took us out front of the bar and took a picture of us all in our wrestling gear and Dominic. And as we're standing there setting up for the picture, Dominic said, so how old are you punks anyway? And I said, I'm 14. Why? How old are you? And he looked at me and he said, you never ask a wrestler's age, kid. And then he said he was 48 years old. So, if you do the math, it was pretty easy to see, as over the decades that I've known Dominic, he was always much older, but, in such incredible shape. He's 85 now, still sharp as a tack, still in very good shape for his age, still does sit-ups and leg-ups and everything every day. Yeah, but that's how I met Dominic, and that was how I got my foot in the door with wrestling. Never planning to. It was just that whenever I was a senior in high school and was getting ready to go to college, I knew I wasn't going to be playing sports at college anymore, and having played sports most of my life, I wanted to do something to stay involved in sports. And so I asked Dominic if he would train me, not to be a wrestler, just train me to stay in shape and to keep involved in something, knowing I was going to be coming home every week to work, every weekend. And he said that he would. Now, I just learned this recently. He said that he would as long as I went to college. And what he recently told me was that my father, and this stunned me, my father wasn't the kind of guy to do this kind of thing, but he drove out to Dominic's house, which is way in the backwoods behind, out in the boondocks from where we live, and said, my dad, and he pointed out in his driveway, he said, it was right down there, your dad pulled out, I was working in the yard, and he said, my dad told him, refuse to train him unless he goes to college. And I already knew I was going to college, but my mother and my father both confronted Dominic and urged him to on that. And Dominic did tell me that that I had to go to college in order to train me, never intending to ever be a professional wrestler.
Was Mick Foley there with you from the start?
No, Mick Foley. That was 1982. I graduated from high school. And 82 through 86 went to Bethany. 1985, Dominic opened his school in 84. It was late 84 that I started training with Dominic and then working some independent shows. Sometime within that next year, it was around 85, that Dominic told me, because he didn't charge me to train, but my job was to get to the school early, unlock it, turn the heat on, clean everything up, shovel the sidewalks off in the winter, etc. And he told me, tomorrow there's a new kid coming, his name's Mickey. So I got there about 6 o'clock in the morning, it's pitch black and a bunch of snow had fallen. And this old beaten up car is sitting there and it's running. But I walk up and look in, and there's garbage all through the car. It looked like a homeless person living there. And I couldn't see any physical features. It was just a big mound of hair and blanket, and it's all covered up. And at first I thought somebody gassed themselves, somebody committed suicide, And I knocked on the window and nothing, and finally started moving, and pulled out, and he said, "Are you Troy?" And I said, "Are you Mickey?" And he said, "Yeah, that's how we met." It was 1985 that he started coming to the Dominic School. And I'm sure you've seen the footage that he took as a film student at Dominic School when we were a lot of snot-nosed kids.
So I'm guessing your first impression of him wasn't of a future world champion.
Not at all, but nor for me. I mean, when we went into training, I remember us talking about, having a career. Not that either of us endeavored to. He was in film school and I was in college for politics. And at that time, as a trainee, you look at the guys on TV and you think of the guys you've grown up watching: Bruno, Harley Race, Jake Roberts, Paul Orndorff, and all of these legendary wrestlers, Dominic DeNucci, and you can't envision yourself anywhere near as good as them. You're having trouble getting the arm dragged down or taking a backdrop. So for neither of us at any time that we were at Dominic School do I ever remember anybody in that school thinking hey, we're going to go on and be a champion or even have a career in the business.
And I guess your first match, you were known as Troy Orndorff. Was that a name you'd had for a while, or what was the story there?
No, Dominic took us to a show in Windsor, Ontario, and I forget if Mick was there. I can't specifically recall. I remember Dominic taking me in. He typically would take a handful of us, so I'm guessing Mickey probably was there. And Crybaby George Cannon was running the shows, his territory at the time. And we walked in, he looked at me and he said, "What's your name?" I said, "Troy Martin." He said, "That's a shit name." He said, I don't go to the ring, I'll think of something. So we go to the ring and the wrestler announces, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, making his pro wrestling debut, the nephew of the great Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff." And I'm thinking it's my opponent. Like, well, Paul Orndorff's nephew's going to be, that's pretty cool. And he announces Troy Orndorff, and I'm thinking, like, it took me a second to realize it was me. And my first thought was, man, if Paul Orndorff hears about this, he's going to be pretty pissed. But that's how I got the name Troy Orndorff, was from Crybaby George Cannon.
And I understand you had a match against Randy Savage pretty early in your career. What was the deal there? Well,
Dominic sent us to, he would send a van full of us, 6, 7, 8 of us to do jobs. And Mickey and I, then they would do 4 hours of tapings in a night, a very long night. And Mickey and I got used up quite often. In fact, every taping. Mickey that night, that was just coincidentally the same night that Mickey got his jaw broken by the British Bulldogs, by Dynamite. My first match was with Randy Savage. I also wrestled Butch Reed that night, Harley Race, and I believe Paul Orndorff. And Mickey had a couple matches before he got his jaw broke. And the other guys that came up with us got paid the same thing that we got paid, but none of them worked, as I recall. And Dominic would send us up there every month or so to do that. I knew pretty early on that I didn't want to use, like, the first or second match, it was under Troy Martin, but I knew I didn't want to use my real name, that if I was going to ever have a career down the road, that if I wanted to use my name. And so I started using the name Mike Kelly.
Okay.
And but that first night with Randy Savage, and there's a good little story about Randy with that. You know, we had seen him on television with, you know, ordering Elizabeth around and treating her like shit and everything. And after the match, I went to find Randy to thank him, and he was very sheepishly knocking on the door, and he's going, Liz, honey, it's me, it's Randy." And I remember when they seen that, I go, "What? It's all a gimmick? It's all a work?" But he was very gracious. He was very thankful to me. All the guys were. Butch Reed was, Harley Race was, Bobby Heenan and Paul Orndorff were. And Randy said to me that night, he said, "Look, kid, if you ever plan on having a career in this business, never forget to thank the guy that put you over like you did for me tonight." And that always stuck with me, you know, because he was one of the biggest names in wrestling history, and certainly at that time. And just really down-to-earth guys. You know, they treated me professionally in the ring, did what they had to do to get themselves over, but I didn't get stiffed at all. The bumps were perfectly timed bumps. They were very professional with me, and Bobby Heenan and Paul Orndorff were equally as gracious. Everybody said thank you, but Paul and Bobby were much like Randy in the first match.
Did you enjoy the experience of wrestling in front of the big crowd and everything?
No. I enjoyed working with the guys I did. But when you walk out in a building full of 10, 20,000 people, and they know you're getting chewed up, you know, there's always a handful of people. "You're gonna get your ass beat, you piece of shit! Get out, boo! You suck!" And you get hit with this the whole way to and from the ring. And somehow on camera, you're gonna put up that excitement that you're really happy to be here. Somehow I was able to drown it out, though, and maintain it. You just have to cut yourself in half in your brain, you know, like from the wrestler and the person.
And I guess the UWF would have been the first major company you worked regularly for. How did that job come about?
Yeah, that was late 85 or 86. Dominic DeNucci had known Bill Watts. The UWF was previously called Mid-South. And Bill Watts and Dominic DeNucci had done a lot of work together and traveled together on the road. Bill was working to try to take the Mid-South national, hence the name UWF, to compete against Vince. was pretty busy. He was technically the booker, but Eddie Gilbert, his assistant booker, was doing most of the day-to-day work. And, excuse me, they had set up with Dominic to do, because Dominic was running, promoting shows in the tri-state area, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. And Bill and him had set up 7 or 8 dates. And Bill sent up, I remember it was Eddie Gilbert and Missy Hyatt, Dark Journey and Missing Link, Buddy Roberts and Chris Adams, Terry Taylor and Bill Irwin. It was a heck of a crew. The UWF television was pretty hot at the time, especially in Pittsburgh, and sent them up. And the rest of the card, Dominic filled out with us as kids, his students. And Mickey and I were always the curtain jerk. He'd always put me and Mickey on first. And at one of the shows in Clarksburg, West Virginia, we wrestled at the Nathan Goff Arena, which was a armory, the National Guard Armory. When you came back to the curtain, there was a hallway, an exit door straight ahead, and 2 dressing rooms off to the right and left. Well, it was a hot night and the door was open. Mick and I were back there on the back patio, like behind the dressing area. And Terry Taylor and Eddie Gilbert and Terry Taylor came out and started talking to us and said, have you guys ever thought of going on the road? Well, neither of us had. Like I said earlier, we didn't think we were good enough to do that. And he said, well, I'm pretty impressed with what I see, and I'd like to bring you guys to UWF, which was, incredible to us. But I still had to finish college. He still had to finish college. And so he agreed to contact, gave his number, and he said, contact me after you guys graduate. And I didn't. I don't know if Mick did or not, but it was a couple months after I graduated, and I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the States, when you borrow money to go to school, you have a 6-month grace period after you graduate to start paying back. And I was probably 3-4 months into mine, and the economy had nosedived a bit, and it wasn't likely that there was going to be any jobs in the near future. Eddie Gilbert called me and said, like to bring you down, you and Mick down. And he set a date with me, and I packed up and left and went. And Mickey was supposed to come in like a week or 2 behind me. And during that time, Bill, trying to go national, had burned up so much capital that he had to put a hiring freeze. So I had just gotten my foot in the door, and they put a hiring freeze, and Mickey then had to go through Memphis and do a different route in. But that was how I got my foot in the door with UWF, and what a learning experience.
What did you think of Bill Watts, meeting him, because he's very controversial?
Yeah. If you ever heard any interviews from me, you hear me mention Bill Watts 1,000 times in the interviews. Looking back at the time, as a kid, a young, scared kid in the dressing room, he's a very intimidating guy. I was about 6'1", 205 at the time, maybe. Bill's 6'3", 6'4", 320, big guy. His pinkies are like my thumbs, and very intimidating, imposing. A loud, boisterous, larger-than-life character. And but there wasn't a lot of interaction with Bill initially. You rarely saw him around, certainly not at the house shows. But at the TV tapings, the first TV taping we had, I'd wrestled the first match with Eddie Gilbert, and of course I didn't call a thing. It was Eddie calling everything. And I came back to the curtain, and I remember just having this feeling of floating, like I'm finally working for a company, and I'm going to be a big star. This is great. And I came through, I'm taking my tape off, and I looked straight ahead, and Bill, the dressing room door was to the right. Bill's standing there with his hands on his hips, like sort of cocked to one side. And he had that strange look on his face, and I didn't say anything. As I walked toward him to go past him into the dressing room, I gave him like a heads up, like, what's up? I didn't say anything. And I went to walk by him. As I took a step into the dressing room, he goes, what the fuck was that? And I stopped dead in my tracks, and in my head I'm thinking, like, is he serious? And what's he? Not that I knew what a good or bad match was, but it felt like it was a good match. Eddie called it. I didn't say a thing. And I quickly settled on, he's ribbing me. It's my first night. He's jacking me a little bit, So I was going to look at him and say, nice rib. And I never spoke a word or a syllable. I looked at him, I got was a smile out, and he came at me like a bear and slammed me to the wall, his face right here, poking me in the sternum hard. And I remember, but he wasn't saying, you piece of shit, you suck, you get the fuck out. It wasn't that. But it was, don't ever turn your fucking back to the camera. If the goddamn camera doesn't see it, it means the people at home don't see you, which means you don't draw me fucking money. He was yelling specific instructions to me. And I had coaches, not that assertive, but in that vein. I never liked it, but I knew, what he was trying to do, teach me. Very intimidating, but I learned from him. And I didn't know that till years later. Years later, I'd catch myself telling stories, and I'd say, well, like Bill Watts taught me, if you don't face the camera, and I'd hear myself invoking Bill Watts' name over and over and over again. And I thought, well, I must have picked something up from him. It was my break into the business.
And I guess that's where you started using the name of Shane Douglas?
Yes. When I got to Texas, I packed my little Renault Alliance up, my $111 a month car with no air conditioning, going to Texas. And packed it up with all my belongings and drove 3 or 4 days to Dallas. And got there, and Eddie Gilbert, I ended up living with Sting. He and his wife Sue had Steve Borden had an extra room. I went to Eddie Gilbert's house to meet with him. He was married to Missy Hyde at the time. And he said, well, you want to use a stage name or not? To be honest, I didn't know what he meant. I knew what a stage name was, but I didn't know why he would even be asking me that. And he said, well, if you use, the stage name or your shoot name, it's up to you. And I said, what's the difference? He said, well, for instance, if you use your shoot name, any mark could call a hotel and say, is Troy Martin registered there? And they'll get rung right through your room. I went, oh, no, I didn't want that. I'm very keen on my privacy. It's one thing to be the franchise in front of the character or in front of the camera, but when I'm off camera, I want to be able to go read a nice book about philosophy or religion or whatever, and watch a good sports or whatever. I didn't want that bleed over. And back then, previous to all this internet and information everywhere, if they told you his name was Shane Douglas on TV, his name's Shane Douglas. So I said, well, no, I definitely want to use a stage name. And he said, well, I'm thinking either Shane or Cody. And I thought about it. I said, well, I like Shane better than Cody. So he and I sat there for what seemed like hours, a good long while, and Missy. We were sitting there and throwing around Troy Shane, Shane Troy, Martin Shane, Martin Troy, just going through all these different incarnations. And Missy had gone into the kitchen, and I remember when you walked out of the living room into the kitchen, there was a wrought iron, looked like a trellis or something right there. And she walked in the kitchen and she made a tray of lemonade, and she came walking around the corner with that tray of lemonade, and she goes, how about Shane Douglas? And me and Eddie both stopped and looked at each other, and I thought, it sounds like it goes together. It sounds like a legit name, and that's where Shane Douglas came from. We had the Shane part, but could not come up with the last part. Missy Hyde came up with the Douglas. Somebody tried to start heat between us. She was, this is probably around the late 80s, early 90s, before ECW. Somebody had called her and told her, somebody called me and told me, that I was pissed off that she was telling everybody that she created the name Shane Douglas. And to the contrary, I'd always told the same story I told you. That it was, we came up with Shane. I came up with Shane after Eddie said Shane or Cody, and that she came up with the Douglas part. And then simultaneously, somebody told her that I was saying that she had nothing to do with the name or something, and it reminded me like I thought, if I didn't know better, I would swear Watts was doing this, because it was a typical Watts, coming up with that, hey, I thought you guys got along kind of stuff, but yeah,
typical wrestling.
Yeah, exactly.
People like to stir up trouble,
and usually with no real reason for it. It's not like, hey, if I pull this on you, I'm going to make $1 million doing it, or the company's going to make $1 million. Just do it to do it. It's just fuck with them to fuck with them.
And since you mentioned Missy Hyatt, we're interviewing her later today. So, any particular stories or memories of her?
Just for me, like at that, because I was such a young kid at that time into the business, and my focus every night was on learning my craft. I was terrified of screwing up. Because I had seen some pretty heady things. I saw Bill Watts direct somebody to hurt a kid in the ring because the kid screwed up several nights in a row after he was screamed at and yelled at. And so I was very intimidated. If I mess up, that's what happens if you mess up. Plus, I really wanted to learn my craft. But I remember Missy being just an incredibly beautiful woman. So Dark Journey, the same thing. I mean, for a young kid from, bumfuck New Brighton, Pennsylvania, and here's these beautiful women on television that are standing right in front of you, but they were all very personable. The one thing I do remember about the UWF dressing room was that it was a pretty at ease dressing room. There wasn't, that I noticed, and maybe it's because I was young and naive, I didn't notice a lot of politicking. I didn't notice any backstabbing. It seemed like more like the dressing rooms that I would come to know in ECW years later, cutting up everybody, hey, where are you going to drink tonight? That it was just like just a good old boy network. And Missy, the one thing that impressed me with Missy, even before I went to UWF, when they came up on that tour to Pittsburgh, was that Missy and Dark Journey were both getting into the ring and doing things that hadn't been done before. The things that we would do in ECW years later to a different degree. But remember, they weren't wrestlers per se. They were valets or managers. And they would always get involved in a spot in the ring, or they were integral. Bill Watts was making the women integral rather than just a pretty face and set of tits and ass at ringside. They were integral to the match and to the storylines, a vital element to all of that, which was far different from what had been done in the wrestling business before that. I've always said in many ways, and maybe it's because of my experience in both places, but to me, the UWF was ECW before ECW came around. Like, if ECW existed in 1980, 4, 5, 6, would we have been able to get away with cut the fucking music? Probably not, and all the violence and blood. Would we have... my guess is we would have looked much more like UWF, heels with heat. The one thing that Bill knew was really how to get all of his talent over. Everybody on the card, from the opening match to the last match, Bill and Eddie Gilbert worked very hard to make sure everybody meant something. It's true, Eddie Gilbert and DiBiase and Duggan, those guys were up here, and Shane Douglas was down here. But Shane Douglas wasn't a nothing. Nobody was. Everybody on the card had some semblance. In fact, my first night in, I beat in Thibodaux, Louisiana, that show with Bill, I beat Eddie Gilbert for the TV title. Didn't know I was, but they worked hard to get us all over, and we all, for my estimation, all learned our craft down there.
Was Scott Steiner there during your time?
Not that I recall. I don't think. I think it was after I was there.
Because I know he didn't get along too well with Bill. So.
Well, that was later in WCW.
Oh, that was in WCW.
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever notice any of these backstage fights that happened in UWF? Because they were known to be a few, and Bill would just let them go.
Yeah. I was there the night that Dick Slater beat Sting up. I don't know if so much beat him. I didn't see the actual fight. I was in the bathroom. Sting was in putting his makeup on, and I washed up and was walking out. Right as I opened the door, Dick Slater was walking in, and Dick was one of those just casual, just go about his way guys. I never had any trouble with Dick, although he's a tough old guy. Stepped aside, and he walked in, and I walked out, and as the door was shutting, I hear hitting, and then I hear the toilet flush, and Dick comes walking out, and it's like he went to the bathroom and came out. I didn't know exactly what happened, but quickly the story circulated around the dressing room. Bill would let things like that go on, and if somebody was getting a little bit too big for their britches, Bill would book them with Slater or somebody and say, hold your own. But even in its own way, and again, not that I'm advocating it, but even in its own way, you can see, especially in the world of the wrestling business, where so many other places, the politics and things play in. Okay, if you don't like your position and you think you can take his position, then go out and take it. It has a way of teaching you a little bit of humility, or maybe I create a hell of a star out of it if you do go out and beat the hell out of my superstar. It wasn't like that was going on quite often, though. It was, here and there, maybe twice or 3 times over the year and a half that I was there. And most times it was usually, broken up within a matter of, a very short time. In the Sting and Dick Slater case, it was again, I didn't see it, but it didn't seem like it was back and forth. It was just a quick bap and out. But it definitely was not run the way I would, being that my introduction to the business and thinking that's the way the business is run, then going later to the NWA and WCW and WWF, very, very differently run.
You're just bringing up joining the NWA/WCW. How did that jump happen?
At the very tail end of the UWF, we were in New Orleans. Eddie Gilbert called us, and just to show you again the nature of the business, then he called us in two separate groups, heels and babies. The heels went first so as not to break kayfabe, and met with Eddie, and then they left. And then we went and met, and Eddie told us that the Bill Watts had to sell the company because he had lost too much money trying to go national and was trying to recoup some of it. So at this night at UNO, University of New Orleans, they were going to have this big NWA versus UWF show. And Eddie apprised us that the booking plan was for the NWA guys to chew up all the UWF guys, which was a bad move on Crockett's part and Dusty's part, because the NWA was already on national television with TBS. The UWF fans down in that area, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas, those fans had, much like the fans in Dallas grew up with the Von Erichs, grew up with the Mid-South UWF wrestling and loved it. That was their brand of wrestling. So to come in here and say, okay, now we're going to have all these guys that you love get squashed, and we're going to bring all these guys you could already get on TV and force them down your throat. Just a bad management move, in my opinion. And Eddie said to us, this is the plan for tonight. He didn't know who was going to be wrestling who yet, but he said this is what they're going to do. And they've already agreed to take Sting and Steiner. They were already taking them over, so they wouldn't be involved in it. But the rest of us were basically going to be fed to NWA talent. And Eddie told us that he had spoken to Lawler in Memphis, and that Lawler had told him that he would take the entire UWF crew, lock, stock, and barrel. So the plan was, when we got to the building, we were all going to join up somewhere, confront Dusty, and then walk out. And again, you learn from all this stuff, So we're all in the room waiting. Eddie calls for Dusty. Several minutes goes by. Dusty comes, opens the door, takes one step in, looks around, and quickly assesses the room and says, Eddie, can I talk to you for a minute? And he pulls him out of the room, and they were gone for several minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Eddie comes back in and says, it's off, we're all going to wrestle tonight. So they must have offered Eddie something to do that. But you could see in that one quick lesson with Dusty how quickly he was able to assess the dressing room and instantly know what was going on. And
obviously he's a master politician.
Yeah, cut the snake right off the head. Eddie, come with me. Boom, we're going to fix this. Just hand Eddie I don't know that that's the case. Maybe Missy would know more, but they must have obviously offered him something. And averted that night, Ron Simmons and I wrestled Lex Luger and Ric Flair, and pretty much ate us up, and it was the slaughter of the WF guys. Within a matter of a few months, all the stations that the NWA had gotten in the deal had dropped the NWA programming, so it was a lot of basically Crockett paid $8.4 million, I think it was, for a couple of ring trucks, a couple of rings, and a couple little odds and ends other than that.
Yeah, I think Bill Watts wrote himself in his book that it was already an out-of-business company, so he just basically worked Crockett into buying it, kind of. Yeah, it was a great move for Bill. And I just saw Bill, ironically, a few years ago. I hadn't seen him since WCW days, and Bill was always a very tense person, just always looked like a very angry person. And I saw him, and he looked great physically. He had slimmed down, but here he looked at peace, at ease. And I wanted to say, you look fantastic. And how are you? It's great to see. That was not Bill from back then. Bill didn't give a shit. Get the fuck out of here. So it was really nice for me to see Bill and see that he's doing so well and found peace in his life. So who eventually brought you into the NWA? Was that Eddie playing a role in that?
Moving from UWF into the NWA, originally, I believe Eddie was implicit in it and had me show up at a taping. And within short order, Dusty had decided, they started announcing that I had been trained by Magnum TA. In reality, I had never met Magnum at that point. I worked with George South and a few other people in the ring to do the belly to belly. And I may be wrong on this, but I don't recall Magnum and I ever doing anything on camera together. But I was brought in with Eddie's help, and then Dusty took a quick shine to me. And George South had later told me, just a couple years ago, said that Dusty pulled him aside and said, "We got this new kid coming in tonight. I want you to shine him," and that was his directions to George South. So it was
because for people that don't know, he was one of the regular jobbers for years, and he was very skilled at that, I guess.
Right, yeah, very good at it. And the truth be known, George was one of the best workers in the company. George just didn't want to go on the road. He had a family and wanted to stay more close to home, and so he was able to get the best of both worlds and not have to sacrifice like you do in the beginning. When you go on the road in this business, as you know, it's a very difficult industry, killer of marriages, and it's really, really tough.
So you eventually ended up as a tag team with Johnny Ace. How did it go from you being Magnum TA's protege to Johnny Ace tag team partner?
There was a point where I was sent home from the NWA, and a week later I was told they were downsizing and didn't have money to send me home. A week later they called me back and said that Brad Armstrong had been fired from the Lightning Express, and they were now going to have me and Tim Horner as the new Lightning Express. I went to Salisbury, Maryland. Tim Horner and I wrestled as the new Lightning Express in Salisbury, Maryland. And the very next day, I get a phone call and said that Brad was back, and they didn't need me anymore. They sent me home. And a few days after that, they brought me back again. And within 6 months, Johnny at that time was when they brought me back, and even before they sent me home, Johnny was there as the flag bearer for the sheep herders. So they told me that Johnny was training to wrestle, and that he was going to be moving into the ring, and then a short time later decided to put us together in the tag team. The ironic thing about the Dynamic Dudes is that we debuted on the Music City Showdown. I think it was called Music City Showdown in Nashville. It was the show where Terry Funk drove Flair through the table. We were the opening match on that pay-per-view versus the Samoan SWAT team with Paul Heyman. And they announced us on air as Johnny and Shane. It was either the Next Generation or the New Generation. And it was so we'd already aired. The next morning we get up to go to the airport. And we get in the van with Eddie Gilbert, who was sitting in the front seat, and Johnny and I are in the second seat. And Eddie turned around and he said, "Well, did you hear your new name?" And I'm thinking, well, we've already aired on TV, so how can we have a new name? I said, "Okay, I'll bite," because Eddie had a bit of a wry sense of humor. I said, "I'll bite, Eddie. What's the new name?" He said, well, Jim Hurd commissioned a study in California with the philosophy that all the hip boards start in California and move eastward. And, the top two words were dynamic and dude. So he put them together and came up with Dynamic Dudes. And I started laughing. That's a good one, Eddie. And I'm laughing out loud, and Eddie stopped with a straight face and turned and looked at me. And I realized that look on his face that he was serious. I said, "Please tell me you're kidding. You're ribbing." And he went, so they said, "No, we were going to Tri-Cities."
So at that point, WCW had been bought, or NWA had been bought by Turner, and it was WCW.
It was now transformed to WCW.
Was
correct. And it was Bristol. I want to say it was Bristol. It was one of the Tri-Cities in Tennessee. And I went right to Flair that night, who was the chairman of the booking committee. And I said, "Rick," I said, "can I talk to you?" And he was laying upstairs on a couch. And I went into him and I told him, I said, "If this is about the name, there's nothing I can do. I said, well, surely you can. You're the chairman of the booking committee. I said, does that not get heat with you? He said, it's a shitty name. There's nothing I can do about it. And I said, and I'm thinking in my head, like, but you're Ric Flair. You're the head of the booking committee. I'm sure if you went to Jim Herd and said this is a bad idea, and he would have nothing to do with it. And so Johnny and I went and did the best we could with it. We thought, well, rather than try to swim upstream, we'll just turn around and swim downstream and see if it works. And we embraced it as much as we could, but it was. It's tough to get something over when a wrestling fan is sitting at home and they see a team getting beat in all the key matches. It doesn't matter if you're going over the enhancement talent, but you're with the Midnight Express and getting beat, and then with this team and getting beat, and then that team and getting beat. It's tough to get you guys over. And Eddie Gilbert, just to show you again how forward-thinking he was, said to us, you guys should turn heel. They should turn you heel and have you slick your hair back and just embrace being dickheads. Fuck you. We love riding our skateboards. That would have gotten a ton of heat, I think. And at that time they wouldn't do it. It shows you how quickly the business was about to change, though, because from 88, 89 frame that we're talking to 92, 93 frame, when suddenly a blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy could be a heel. But it was Eddie Gilbert and Bill Watts that had first seen the heels in us, and certainly me.
Did they provide the skateboards, or was that up to you?
What was funny about that was they took us out on a shopping trip, with the Ted Turner cards. We didn't have them, the handlers with us did. So Johnny buzzed me and he said, let's see how serious they are. Let's spend as much money as we want and see if they complain. Because they were telling us they were going to give us this big push, and we were the next Rock and Roll Express and all that. So we went into these skateboard. Who knew? These skateboard shops, you can go and spend $100. You can spend $5,000 if you want. They have all these varying levels of things. So we weren't getting 1 or 2 skateboards. We were putting 7 or 8 skateboards up there, and not 1 or 2 of these cheap things. We were getting 10 of these expensive things, and just throwing stuff on the counter. And they just kept charging. And everyone said, no, just less than that, or kept charging. I think by the end of the day, we'd spent over $5,000 each, and never had any blowback. Nobody ever called us and said, "You guys spent way too much." So that was all bought from Ted Turner, and they bought that stuff so we could go out and shoot all those different vignettes. Us riding this, the water skis and the motorcycles, and we spent several days going around locations all over Atlanta, Georgia, and just long days, shooting north of the city, south of the city, heart of the city, here, there, from sun up till sundown. So, pretty arduous, but we were happy. We knew we were starting to get a push. We thought we were starting to get a push, and we're eager to pitch in any way we could on that.
And at one point, they had Jim Cornette managing you guys, and I guess something happened there, and Jim Cornette has talked poorly about the whole angle since. Could you shed some light on that?
Yeah, they at the time, I think Stan maybe was hurt, and so they wanted to keep Jim on television, obviously, and so they had him managing us, and portraying it to the fans that he had left the Midnight Express and was going to go this route. They never told us where it was going, but I knew there was no way they were taking Jim Cornette from the Midnight Express. It just was too hot of an entity for them for a draw. And so then when they brought him back, he was managing, when I think it was Stan that got hurt, brought him back, he was managing both of us. And a couple times we did some 8-mans and things. And I can't remember, I think it was up north. Somewhere in the north that Jim turned on us and hit me with the racket. And when he did, I remember the crowd just popping, exploding, like they were the baby faces and we were the heels. And I don't think there were any angles at that time in WCW that were being handled well. The booking committee, in my estimation, was that Ric Flair was only worrying about what Ric Flair, what it implicated Ric Flair, who he was working with or whatever. Jim Cornette was only worried about what Jim Cornette was involved in, and nobody was taking the time to look at the overall picture. You know, in a successful promotion, this angle has to seamlessly move into this angle, which has to seamlessly move into the next and the next and the next. Instead, it was just sort of like, this block is Jim Cornette's block, and this block is Ric Flair's block, and this block is whoever's block. The committee it never, in my estimation, worked. And I recall watching the show at that time, that after Dusty had left and they were going to this booking committee, the show suddenly took on a feel of like it had stepped back. You know, like it didn't have that compelling element to it anymore, in my estimation, and watching as a fan.
And finally, about Johnny Ace, are you surprised that he ultimately ended up with a pretty good position in WWE, and I think he's still pretty high up there these days?
No, not at all. And I'll tell you why. Johnny was an educated guy. Ironically, he and I both grew up in towns called New Brighton. Him in New Brighton, Minnesota, and me in New Brighton, Pennsylvania. We were both educated, and we knew that how the business was run. Like much like I did, I was a guy that always paid attention. Like, why is the camera guy shooting it like that? Why did the director just cut from camera 2 to 3 on that? And why did the booker put this guy over on that guy? And I was always ingesting all parts of it. You know, there were guys in the dressing room going, "Hey, did you see the beautiful girl in the 3rd row?" And I'm thinking, like, no, I was paying attention to the shoot. You know, I was paying attention to the direction. And Johnny was very similar to that. Johnny was constantly having ideas. We'd be driving down the road and Johnny would say, "You know, what they're doing with the Road Warriors, I would have done this instead of that." And then we'd bounce it back and forth and talk about it. So you could tell that Johnny really had a head on his shoulders for delving beyond just who's winning and who's losing. And I remember Johnny vividly. He used to say this quite often, in fact. He used to say, "You know, one of these days you and I are going to be running the industry, and when we get up there, we're going to do things differently." And not that any of us ever said we're going to be the number 2 guy at the WWE or ever book any place, but you're just doing the natural progression of things. You're not going to wrestle forever, and when you move past that, we become an agent, a writer, a promoter, a booker, whatever. Johnny always seemed to have that to me. I don't know if he would say the same thing back. I'm guessing he would, because the two of us were very like-minded in that way.
Did you ever have any dealings with him in later years? I know you never went back to WWE, but was there ever any talks in the days when he was in charge?
No. I saw him. I took my. At the time, Connor was 6, so this is 10 years ago, give or take. They had the last show ever in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. Not that I wanted to go to a WWF show. You know, it's no secret to the fans. It's not my cup of tea. It's not I love seeing guys wrestle and counter and take down. You know, the flippity flop stuff. That's just acrobatics to me. It's like a dance. But my son, who at that time was still into wrestling, and you know had all the action figures and the WWE video games and everything. He had been to wrestling shows before, but I don't think he'd ever been to a WWE show, and they were tearing the Pittsburgh Civic Arena down. Now, that was the building that I grew up watching wrestling in, that my dad had taken me to wrestling in. So I took Connor just so that I could show him the building that my dad, his granddad, had taken me to. And it was just sort of like more of a family lesson to my son. And we walked in, I'd called Joey Styles and gotten tickets. Johnny didn't even know I was going to be there. I walked in and very quickly ran into him, and we talked, but he was busy, as you can imagine, a TV taping, and he was running around. We said hello, spoke briefly, and that was it. We had not spoken since I tried to call him one time, probably shortly after that, just to catch up, like, hey, we got a chance to run into each other, let's follow up and reconnect. And never got a call back.
It seems like you would have been a good producer or agent for WWE, so I'm surprised they never reached out to you in that capacity, if you would even been interested.
Well, remember when Vince, like for all the fans that are saying, like, there's like this rumor online that Bam Bam Bigelow is getting inducted, and I hope he is. He certainly would deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. But the fans are, on Twitter, hitting me up and on Facebook saying, you ought to be the one to induct him. I think it would be appropriate. You know, Bam Bam and I had a pretty good and long connection in wrestling with a triple threat. But if you go back and remember the history of the relationship between me and Vince McMahon, it was far from the best.
Which I'm going to get into. But to end off this run in WCW, what led to you leaving at that point?
Well, we were making decent money. You know, not great money, but, you know, for a kid, at the time I was probably in my mid to late 20s, didn't have a bill. And you know, my rent payment was like $230 a month or something at home. I was never there. I was just someplace to drop my bags. I had a substantial amount of money saved, and there was a point where we were at a television taping in Baton Rouge, trying to just recall the specifics. I had been off with, I had some blood clots on my knee and a few tears in my knee, and had to be off for 3 or 4 weeks. The entire time that I was off, Jim Ross, who was on the booking committee, kept calling me, and other people on the committee kept calling me at home and saying, hey, as soon as you can get back, we really need you back. And they talked, I remember specifically them all talking very, very badly, negatively about Sting and Luger. These son of a bitches make all this money, they cry about everything, they're, just really negatively. And they told me then that they were splitting me and Johnny up and were going to give me a big singles push. So I get back on the road, go to Baton Rouge, my first day back in a month, 3 weeks, a month, whatever. After these weeks of phone calls about this singles push, and I go to catering and sit my tray down, and Missy Hyatt had just come out of the booking meeting, and she got her tray and she came over and asked if she could sit with me, and she sits down and she goes, Shane, I don't want to start anything, but they were really talking badly about you in that booking meeting. And I'm thinking, like, I just got back. How can they be talking negative? So in my head, I'm thinking maybe Missy got mixed up on something. They were talking about Sting and Luger or whatever. So, but it piqued my interest. So I left to go find Jim Ross. And halfway down the hallway towards where Jim Ross's office was, I ran into Teddy Long, who was just a referee at the time and had just started managing Mark Callis. He had a clipboard, like it was a boss or something. And Mark Callis was there with him, and he stopped and said, okay, Shane, tonight in segment 3 or 4, whatever the number, you're going to be working with Mean Mark here. 3 or 4 minutes, he'll take it with the heart punch. I went, no, that's not what I've been. I said, I'll be happy to put him over, but that's not what I was told. And he goes, well, that's what you'll do, or like it or leave it. I said, well, we'll find out. I went to find Jim. I went down and I found Jim, and I explained to him what Teddy had just said and reminded him what he had told me in these phone calls over the last month. And he said, no, that stupid SOB has it all wrong. And he said, go find Jody Hamilton. He'll tell you. So I searched the building for Jody Hamilton, and when I walked into the building, it was like in the Baton Rouge Centralplex, the dressing rooms are like the old, like Hollywood days. They have the lights around the mirrors, and the little table in front, the partition off the wall for the counter. And I walked in the door, and I'll say if I'm Jody Hamilton looking into the mirror, I walk in over here, and he won't even look at me. He doesn't even turn to address me. He just keeps going like this, writing. And I said, well, I'm getting this, was told this in these phone calls. Missy Hyatt told me that. Teddy Long told me this. Jim Ross told me that. This way. What? Give me the lowdown. He threw his pencil down. Still never looked at me. He threw his pencil down and he said, you'll do the goddamn job to Mark Callis in 2 or 3 minutes with the heart punch, or you can get your ass the fuck out of here. Okay. He wants me to get my ass the fuck out of here, and I threw a garbage can at him, garbage at him. I was like, fuck you. I'd had it at that point of the politics. I'd tolerated it. At this point, I'd been around the business for 6, 7, 8 years, and coming from the UWF was not used to that kind of shit, and had tolerated it. To this day, I can't understand what the weeks of phone calls were to my house. It's one thing to sit there and say, let's play a rib on so-and-so. It's another to say, it's sort of demented to say, let's call him for weeks on end and tell him something and then get him here and do this to him. To me, if that's what you wanted from me, I'm under contract. If you'd have called me and said, hey Shane, we come back, we're gonna split you and Johnny up, we're gonna job you out for a little bit and then start. No harm, no foul. You know, it was, to be clear so everybody understands, you know, I was never really the world champion. And when somebody beat me, they never really were beating me either. It was a work.
It's like an acting job.
Exactly. If the director tells me to take a bullet and die, I take the bullet and die. And but what upset me at that time then, and always has, is the absolute lack of ability of being a man. To look you in the eye and say, this is what we want you to do. Lie to you, 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 then try to play tough guy with you. And I remember as I was walking out, you know, I grabbed my bags and was leaving, and Tom Zank, who sadly just passed away, Brian Pillman, who sadly passed away several years ago, and Johnny Ace stopped me in the parking area, and they said, look, you know, you walk out, they're going to fire you, you're going to lose your contract. I said, guys, I don't give a shit. I'm so far past this. Boy, I'd had it, like up to here, you know. And Wahoo McDaniel came out and goes, kid, and he stopped me and goes, what the fuck are you doing? And I told him, he goes, you don't want to do that, kid, because, you know, you're going to burn a bridge. And I said, well, no disrespect to you, but I don't give a fuck about burning the bridge. I don't give a fuck if I'm not in this business anymore. But at that time, what they didn't know is I'd been talking, not behind their backs, I was talking to Pat Patterson just as a connection in the business, a contact. I'd never once asked him for a job. I'd never once asked him, will there be a prospect for a job? It was just, hey, can you give me some advice, that kind of thing. And I got to Baton Rouge Airport to fly home, and all flights connected through Atlanta to Pittsburgh. So while I was in Atlanta for my connection, had like a couple hour layover, I called Eddie Gilbert to tell him what was going on. Because at this time we were hearing, you know, again, you could never get a straight answer from anybody, but we were hearing rumors that what the office would want in Atlanta would be disseminated in the field at the tapings, and then the politics would take place there.
Right. Was it still Hurd running it in Atlanta at that time?
Yeah, right. Still Hurd running it, but running it like on a corporate, more like the CEO. Right. Eddie Gilbert was more involved in the booking in the office. He was no longer going out to the tapings.
Joey Hamilton was on the booking committee, I assume.
Yes, and I wanted to make sure, before I did walk out of the company, I wanted to make sure that this, find out for myself, was the office aware of this? Because were these phone calls about me getting this big singles push, was that legitimate coming from the office, and now somebody out in the field pulling something else? And I called Eddie Gilbert, and Eddie said, yeah, don't fly to Pittsburgh tonight. Go check into the hotel. Go see Jim Hurd in the morning, and, you know, make sure you clear everything with him. So I went the next morning. I waited for him to come in. He came in about an hour late, and I expected to have, you know, a fairly intelligent conversation with the guy. Instead, he starts talking down to me and saying, at one point we go in his office, he keeps on telling me, I'm making a big mistake, I'm making a big mistake. He never clarified what I was making the big mistake about, but then he said, I'm going to show you something. And he's leafing through his drawer, and he pulls out a piece of paper, and he hands it to me. And I reach for it, he pulls it back, and he goes, now, before I give this to you, I'm going to let you know, you probably won't be able to understand it, being that you're a wrestler. I said, I got 2 fucking master's degrees, you jackass. I can understand anything on this goddamn desk. And I looked at it, and he starts explaining. Sadly, the dumb wrestler that couldn't understand it keenly well, he didn't understand it. They had the WWF rating, and then they had, at that time, there were still like Portland, Memphis, Dallas. There were still a handful of, you know, the smaller territories. He had taken, and he had these 2 numbers circled. The numbers that he had circled was the WWF rating versus all of these ratings combined. So Portland added with Memphis, added with Dallas, added with this one and this one and this one. And they still lost by like 0.3 of a percentage point.
Was WCW included in that?
Well, it was the WCW number. I believe it was.
Yeah, so they would have been with all the combined.
Yeah, so, and his argument at that time was, see, so we're not that far behind. And I said, well, if you circle this number and this number, you'll see you're light years behind. And at that point, it was clear to me that if this is the guy running this company, it's no wonder what's happening out in the field is happening, and they haven't got a chance of competing with WWF. And that's when I left, and I went to the airport. Before I got on my plane to fly to Pittsburgh, I called Pat, and Pat said, call me Monday morning, we'll talk then. That's how I got my foot in the door from 1990 to go to WWF.
So I guess in WWF did you have to have a tryout, or did they automatically give you right into the mix?
No, no tryout. I went straight to the first taping. I had no guarantee of spot. It wasn't like I was coming in as the franchise Shane Douglas or whatever, or even the dynamic dude Shane Douglas. It was just Shane Douglas. I was given a mid-card position. I wasn't getting beaten on a nightly basis. I wasn't winning on a nightly basis. It was just, I was sort of there. But I remember my 1990 stint there. I was there for about a little over a year. I enjoyed it. I really had fun. I was working with guys like Jake Roberts and Haku and, some pretty talented guys. Occasionally I'd slide them over, or like I remember me and Haku, we did Broadways quite often, and
15-minute Broadways.
Yeah, and I remember thinking to myself, even giving me that, going toe to toe with this guy for 15 minutes is a hell of a start for me. A lot better than what I was getting there. And I made decent money. I didn't get rich, but I made comparable to what I was making in WCW under contract. And enjoyed it. I had a good time there in 1990. I can't say anything negative about the WWF or Vince at that time.
Now, I was a pretty big fan of it back then, and I don't recall any vignettes of you before you made your debut. Were there any done?
In the WWF?
Yeah.
No, but Vince wanted to. I used to play bass guitar and sang and wrote music. At that time, Vince wanted, I remember him sitting in his office and, looking me up and down, and had different sketches for outfits. And he wanted to, what he told me was he wanted to create a legitimate rock star. Somebody who was out on tour making and doing that industry, and then coming back and doing much more what he would do years later, like with The Rock or, Jericho with music. And, they had Jimmy Hart. I went to the Pittsburgh before I went on the road. They came to the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. I went and met with Jimmy Hart, and he had 3 or 4 songs written in 3 or 4 versions, like a bubblegum version, a rock version, a heavy metal version. And we sat in the back with just a little recorder, like a little machine, and he'd play the music and I would sing to it. And he said, well, I think you're more in this range, and he'd like rewrite the notes to the song. One was American Girls, another one was called Rockin' Down the Halls. And I can still remember the line to Rockin' Down the Halls. It was, me and my boys, me and my boys are going rocking down the hall. We're doing what we want because we're skipping study hall. It was something like cornered along that line. But, the music that Jimmy had written had a good hook to it, and I thought to myself, if they allow some interaction and back and forth, I could probably do this. And that's when the girls came up with if you remember the outfit that had the leather straps and the denim and the tearaway pants that the seamstress girls had made. And right as that all started coming together is when my dad came down with latter stage emphysema. And Vince and I had a long talk, and it was either Niagara or Erie. I want to say it was Niagara. And I told him what was going on, and he told me family always comes first. He put this glowing story on the table about his mother. My mother's my hero. She took care of us, on and on and on. So you can imagine my surprise years later when I read in Playboy magazine the accusations. But he said to me that the door was always open for me to come back. I'd been a great employee. Go home, take care of your father, and good or bad outcome, when you're ready to come back, just give me a call.
So it was your choice to leave, and basically they just brought you in as an extra hand to do whatever job was available. Right. But they liked what you did, and they were about to give you a gimmick, but you took the family option.
Exactly right, yes.
Okay. And I'm guessing you stayed with your father till the end. And
yeah, that was 91. That was was December when that happened, because I remember I had to get a job. That's my first teaching job. That started back in January when the kids came back. That was January. My dad passed away in August of 93, so a couple years.
Now, when you were a teacher at that time, did the kids know you from TV?
Initially, they didn't, because the first 2 years that I taught, the kids that I were teaching were special ed kids, and so they were, not that they weren't into wrestling, but thankfully I hadn't been a big star on WWF television, so I don't think they ever put two and two together. I didn't dress anything like that. I had my hair pulled back in a ponytail, wore my glasses and things, and the kids never really put two and two together. A couple kids did. The second year that I taught, I remember some kids came and they had a picture that was taken during a vignette shoot where, my shirt was half pulled open and there were some pretty women around me and things. And, I took it from the morality clauses like they have in these ridiculous morality clauses that they have, that my morality is better than your morality. That's the kind of thing that, as stupid as it sounds, that can get you fired as a teacher. Because God knows, having a risque picture of you with pretty women having your shirt half unbuttoned must have meant that you did something, illicit. So it's, but yeah, it wasn't until years later, especially when I started in ECW in '93, that the kids really started putting two and two together.
Because I can imagine that might cause some issues just with disciplining them and so keeping them focused.
You'd be surprised. When I went to school, if I'd had a 253-pound former champion wrestler as a teacher, I'd have been mortified to say anything back to them. I was, back then teachers could slam your head off a wall, and did mine several times. But the kids by that time had been learning that, the old saying, the inmates running the asylum. The kids had learned at that time, you can't raise your voice to me, you can't touch me, you can't this, you can't that. So the kids would come in, not many, but there was always that kid that thought he was going to make a point, because he didn't think you could do something to him. And what he didn't realize was that there was certain other ways to handle things that, maybe cut a corner here or there that, somebody doesn't see something, your word against mine type of thing. I only ever had to do that one time. I pulled a kid into the faculty bathroom after he had made threats against another student, and I made my point to him a little more clearly than I would typically in a classroom. It was astounding how he got it. Keenly understood what I was trying to convey to him, and did not harass that student later. This student, by the way, was a student who had been perfectly healthy till she was 5 years old, was hit by a car and had head trauma. So she had a brain injury. And I won't say her name, but I enjoyed her in class because she tried. And she was a little bit heavy set, and if I asked a question before I'd even finish the question, her hand was going up. Who was the first? What was it? And half the time she'd nail it, she'd get it right, and the other half she could have been more wrong. But she was trying, and that's all I wanted from my kids. When she would miss a question, these other kids, especially this kid I'm talking about, they would call her jelly bean. And it was a negative term to her, and we'd get her wound up and riled up. And I warned them about it, I threatened them about it, and then finally this kid said something in class of what he was going to do to Jelly Bean. Let me talk to you for a second. And, it just, my sense of fairness to people, you don't treat people like that. And, you certainly don't make fun of somebody that has that kind of a, handicap to overcome. And unfortunately, a lot of these kids didn't see that. And the way the system, from my estimation, the way the system was set up, it was protecting kids like that. And in my estimation of this or that, then endangering this student, because you can imagine within a year or two, this girl's old enough to quit school. Will she rather sit here with these other jackasses and keep getting called names, or quit and leave? And I'd much rather invest time and resources into her than the jackasses.
So surprisingly, after what you just told us about your first experience in WCW, you went back to WCW in '92. What led to that?
I was teaching at the time, I wasn't teaching for a school district, I was teaching for an entity called the BVIU, the Beaver Valley Intermediate Unit. In Pennsylvania, the laws had just changed. Special education was all umbrellaed in the county under one entity. So in this case, Beaver County Intermediate, Allegheny County Intermediate Unit, whatever county, Butler County Intermediate Unit. I was hired by the Beaver Valley Intermediate Unit to teach socially emotionally disturbed kids, called emotional support now. And they had the state was trying to downsize. Ultimately, what the state did was what had happened. They wanted to move that into the school district because it was then cheaper for the state. So they kept cutting the budgets and cutting the budgets, and what that meant was they were cutting number of teachers. And I was the low man on the totem pole because I was last in, one of the last in. The good thing for me was nobody wanted that class. Those were the tough kids that would fight, and they weren't cognitively impaired. They were just behaviorally impaired kids. And so most of the, especially women teachers that taught for the BDIU, didn't want that classroom. So I was safe for most of that first year. By the end of the second year, there had been so many cuts and downsizing that now my job was in threat. It was very unlikely that I was going to be called back the next year. So at that time, Marty Jannetty called, and we reconnected because he and I had done some things in '90 as the New Rockers when Sean was off with a knee injury. And he said that he had spoken to Kip Fry, who was running WCW at the time, and that he had gotten him to guarantee us $4,000 a week to go back as the New Rockers. And I thought, well, there's pretty likely that this job will be gone, and step right into that right after this job is done at the end of this school year. Perfect. And after I put my notice in with the BDIU that I was definitely leaving, Marty had that incident where a girl ended up dead at a party at his house. Yeah. And Kip Fry rescinded the offer immediately, but I had already signed with them. So I was already stuck going in, had no other job, so I thought, well, just going to ride this out and see where it goes. I went, and it was just a single there for a while, and then Bill Watts had the idea of putting me and Ricky Steamboat together.
Oh, so when you came back, it was Kip Fry running the office part and Bill Watts was the booker?
I may be wrong on this, but I believe Kip Fry is who I signed or agreed to return with for no specific money. It was a nightly. And then he was either let go, quit, was fired, whatever. By the time I'd gotten there, Bill Watts was now running it, which I thought was good for me because I knew that I'd had this relationship with Bill before. I knew Bill liked my work. I'd always been respectful of him. And so I thought at least it's a more positive thing. I didn't know Kip Fry from Adam. I'd never met him other than talk to him on the phone. And so when I learned that Bill Watts would be taking over, I thought that can only be good for me.
How was Bill in WCW compared to Mid-South? Was he as intimidating to everyone as he was there with the corporate company?
It tried to be in some ways, not as overt as he had been, but I remember one night we were in center stage, and I'd always gotten along fantastically with Rick Rude. I'd always gotten along with most everybody in the dressing room. And Bill called me into his office, and he said, I thought you and, because at the time we were angled with Vader and Rude. And he said, I thought you and Rick Rude got along. So we do, why? He said, well, you didn't hear this from me, but he's really been talking shit anytime you're fucking the matches up. And at first, that doesn't sound like Rude, because Rude's the kind of guy that comes straight to you,
Yeah.
Hey, you're fucking up, kid. And but I remember, for a second, I caught myself thinking, why would Rick say that? And then I started thinking about it afterwards, and I went to Ricky, and Ricky goes, well, then I found out from Rude that he had gone to Rude and said the same thing to Rude. And an old promoter's trick so that you don't, because we were starting to have pretty good matches, me and Steamer against him and Vader. This way you keep from at each other's throats instead of going in and asking for more money. And Ricky pointed it out to me, and I just knew it wasn't Rick because Rick was a pretty in-your-face guy. If he had something to say to you, he would definitely say it to you. But once we, talked, that never went any place. But that just, to me, seemed to be beckoning back to Bill Watts playing the same type of games that he had before.
How was working with Vader?
Snug. I wouldn't say stiff. When it was his time to get his, he took it. But he also would give you yours. To have you move, fire up on me, roll over and tag Ricky. So it wasn't like he just ate me up and then get Ricky in, and Ricky did all the superstar stuff. Both Leon and Rick were very professional with me and helped teach me in that time that I was with Ricky and we were angled together.
Was it Bill Watts that paired you with Ricky?
Yes. He came to me when I first got there, and remember I'd gone on a nightly. I had no guarantee after the Kip Fry thing and with Marty had fallen through, and he said, I can't guarantee, the money's tight, I can't, they're cutting budgets everywhere, which is one of the reasons why I think Fry left. And if I'm recalling correctly, it was because Kip Fry was giving out these big dollar contracts to everybody. And so the company came back and said, we're going to really pull this in. And he said, if you can commit to me, Shane, just 1 quarter, work 1 quarter, I'll guarantee you $300 a night. Show me in that first quarter that you've got something to offer the company, and I promise you second quarter we'll get you a contract. Well, keep in mind, I'd been off the road for over 2 years. So I thought, well, that's only fair. It's not like I've been hot on TV last month or 6 months ago. So as long as I can make, cover my road expenses, that's fine. So I agreed to that. It was in that first quarter that he put me with Ricky. He had Ricky with Dustin for a short while, and I can't recall the specifics as to why he just came. I'm pretty sure that he knew that I still had to learn how to be a main eventer, how to make a comeback. I was a great seller and had good fire, but I didn't know how to make a really good prolonged comeback. Didn't know how to work a main event. To me, every match on the card was the same, and so Ricky at that time was available. And I think getting to that point, he was probably in his mid to late 40s. Not that he was in bad shape, he's still in phenomenal shape. But I think that they thought for his sake, put him with somebody that can take the bumps and give him a little more longevity. And Ricky and I really hit it off. We were, became very, very good friends, kindred spirits. We were very, neither of us were big drinkers or didn't take drugs or anything. That put us together, and we started to gel pretty quickly. Ricky was such a professional. Most people in that position would say, well, I'm working with this young kid, so, shine me up and then get the heat on Shane and I'll make the comeback. To the contrary, Ricky was the exact opposite. See, at that time, I didn't like to make comebacks. I got nervous and, hesitant and, froze up a little bit. And I would think the heat would be on me tonight. And I'd be on the apron, we'd be doing our ins and outs, and all of a sudden Ricky would take some kind of big bump and he'd sit up and say, I got you, partner. And I'm feeling like, oh, fuck, now I got to make a comeback tonight. I'd get all worried. And so that's how gracious Ricky was. And every night we'd be in the car and he'd say, hey, tonight when you did this and this, and that was okay. But what if you'd have done this before that spot and then come out of it and done this? And I'd be looking out in the dark of the night and rolling that through. I could see it in my head like a movie. And I'd be seeing what he was saying. Man, that would be awesome. That'd be incredible. Why didn't I think of that? And that's how it was every night with Ricky. Ricky was never one to say, man, you shit the bed today. Even when you did shit the bed, he'd come in and say, yeah, it was okay, but. And then he'd take it another way and really started, connecting with Ricky. Bill Watts called me to his office somewhere right around the end of that first quarter. And he said, at that time we'd go down I think it was Tuesday or Thursday, and cut the promos downstairs at the CNN Center. And they would insert them into the shows. He said, I've been watching your promos, Shane. He said, anybody ever told you you're a goddamn stone cold heel? And other than Eddie saying at that time with the Dynamic Dudes, I said, no, not really. And he said, well, you are. And he said, what do you think about turning heel on Ricky and working the program with Ricky Steamboat? Well, who wouldn't love to work a program with Ricky Steamboat, right? I mean, one of the greatest baby faces of all time. But as I started thinking about it, sitting in his office, I thought, well, it's still, I'm in my head, and I'm sure to the fans, it was still Ricky Steamboat and Shane Douglas. We weren't anywhere near this even. It was still, I still had a lot to learn from him. And I said, I thought about it for about 10, 15 minutes, and I said, boy, Rick, or Bill, as much as I would love to work with Rick, I just don't think the fans would buy it. And he said, why not? And I said, because I don't think I'm anywhere near his level yet. And he sat back in his chair and put his hands behind his head and said, I always knew you would be the one that picked this business up. And then that's when they came up with Brian and Steve for the Hollywood Blondes. So it still worked out for us because we had an incredible team to work with off of it. But the original inception of the Hollywood Blondes was to be me and Brian Pillman.
Oh, okay. That would have been quite something, actually.
Yeah.
And a lot of people remember that feud in WCW from that time. I certainly do, as a fan of WCW. What are some of the highlights of that feud for you?
Oh my God, it was fun. It was just fun. I see kids today, in the back and say, okay, we'll do this, and then we do this, and then we do this, and they go over it and 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 over it. We never spoke. If we spoke beforehand, it was me. The only person that would speak would be Ricky. He would say, okay, why don't we do something tonight where we work the leg spot? And then just a general outline of a go-home. And the rest was done in the ring. And Brian and Steve's timing was so impeccable, that I used to do the spot where he would beat me up and Irish whip me to the turnbuckle, and I would do a blind turnaround, cross body. Well, when you do that, you can't stop, and you can, but then it loses some of the impact of the move. Every time you do it, no matter who you're doing it with, there's always your stomach knots up a little bit, I hope they're there, because you're going blind. Austin, every night I would do that with Austin. He wasn't just in the perfect spot. He was in the perfect spot. He would hit it perfectly, come up off of it perfectly, sell it perfectly. And you just got to a real comfort zone with Brian and Steve because you knew that they were so fluid on their end. The only thing that made tough working with them was that they would get a little bit wrapped up too much into it. Like the one night in Detroit, they had beaten me, and Ricky and I had gone over on them, and they beat us down afterwards. And the out on the match or on that segment was to take our titles and lay them on our chest, like, okay, you may be the champion, but we just whooped your ass, and leave. Instead, they both get wound up, and Steve was with Steamboat, and Brian was with me. They threw the belt busted me and busted my lip open and chipped Ricky's tooth. And I remember watching Brian and Steve walk down the stairs and walking back, and we should still be laying out and selling. Ricky looks at me and he rolls over and he goes, "Let's go, partner." And he jumped right up and he shot down those stairs like 15 feet behind Brian and Steve. And it was the only time I'd ever seen Ricky lose his cool. He's going, "Look at my partners, look at my fucking tooth." And it was uncalled for. But that was because Brian and Steve were inhabiting their characters. They were really living that character, which bled through on camera. No surprise that Steve went on to the greatness that he became in the business, what he ascended to. And I have no doubt that Brian Pimmel would have done similar had he not passed away at such a young age.
Do you think WCW dropped the ball with that tag team because they were really over?
Yeah. Again, the politics in WCW were more its undoing than look, let's face it, dealing with wrestlers and prima donnas can be a real pain in the neck. But there's also an awful lot of money involved in it. Look, just go ask Vince. But especially when Time Warner took over, Ted Turner was the impetus behind pro wrestling being on TBS and TNT and all the Turner properties. When Time Warner took over, there was almost, today they would call it the elitists. The elites didn't. The elites that were running WCW, Time Warner, didn't think, they thought they were above pro wrestling. Pro wrestling is for the rednecks and those people down there. I remember Dinah Myers, who was the lead attorney for WCW, she was vocally pissed off that these wrestlers were making more money than her. And how could that be? She had a law degree and we were just nasty old wrestlers, Well, if she wanted to come on the road with us anytime and do what we did, she's more than welcome to and probably could have made a better paycheck. The reality was we were drawing more money. And but that was the attitude. Time Warner didn't really want wrestling on. And so if you don't really want, that piece of furniture over in the corner, you get rid of it. And it was pretty clear that when they took over, that from the time Time Warner took over, that WCW became sort of like the redheaded stepchild. And so I've often said in interviews, the only time that Vince in the battle between WCW and WWF ever really had competition was at the very outset of that, when Turner was still in control, which was the very small portion of that time. And then once Time Warner took over, Vince, in my estimation, has never had real competition. ECW, as hot as it got, we weren't a pimple on his ass. We were a tiny little company, and although we had a great fan base, but we still were nowhere near being able to compete on a night-to-night basis with WWF on a corporate level. WCW wasn't. TNA, although they had all the resources, never were. And so there's been all these false starts, and I think as a result, Vince McMahon has gotten a bit complacent and believing that nobody can compete with them, which is a fallacy.
And now he appears to even be bored with his own product.
Yeah, at all the wrong time, right? But we were talking about this on the way. Just to take a little sidebar here. From all appearances to me, it looks like a shit idea, right? To try to start. I mean, regardless of the ratings decline and everything else, the NFL, like the movie Concussion said, still owns a day of the week. But if you look at the ratings decline and you look, like I just watched the Patriots-Jaguars game, and as somebody who's been watching football for all my life, I kept asking, because I hadn't watched a full game in a couple of years. I kept asking my buddy, why was that a flag? Or why was that hit against Gronkowski? Why was that a penalty? And why wasn't that a touchdown? And why'd they blow the whistle? Like, I didn't know the game anymore. I'm watching a game I've watched all my life, and I couldn't understand it. I think that the NFL has gotten so politicized. I don't know if you saw this week, they just turned down an ad from a Veterans Association and refused to run it. They wanted to buy an ad and they wouldn't sell it to them. There's a lot of people in America that are just pissed off about the politics and like in my case the so many rules changes that it doesn't seem like football anymore. That starting a new league in 2 years, if the NFL continues doing what they're doing next year and we see a similar decline, which I don't see why it would turn around, 2 years from now people might be saying Vince McMahon's a genius again. Who knows? It's crazy, but I think the last thing the WWE right now needs is for him to take his eye off of it and doing anything else. It needs a lot of help right now.
I agree with you on that, even though I'm not even inclined to watch it at all.
You and me both.
What's happening? So you left WCW, I guess, or what happened? It was only about a year or so stint this time?
Yes. Ricky and I'd worked through the first quarter at $300 a night. Brian and Steve were making six figures. Ricky was making a strong six figures, and I was making $300 a night. So I went back to Bill the second quarter, and I said, Bill, remember our deal? And he said, Shane, I'm so sorry. He said, they just cut the budget again, and gives me this song and dance if I would just please hang in there for one more quarter, and on and on. Well, what am I going to do? Walk out in the middle of a title run? So I looked at him and I said, Bill, I will give you one more quarter, but next quarter, if there's no new contract, accept that as my notice right now. So I worked through the next quarter and had never told Brian, Ricky, or Steve what I was making. I didn't think it was any of their business. But I have to admit, it was a big chip on my shoulder each night. I'm going out and these guys are making a lot of money, and I'm one quarter of this match and I'm making pennies. Then right at the end of that second quarter, Bill Watts gets fired and Ole Anderson comes in. So I went to Ole and I said, hey, we had this deal, if you want to call Bill, blah, 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 explained the whole thing to him. He said, well, come in and see me Monday. We'll get this all taken care of. So I went in Monday. Good old Ole. I'm thinking we're going to have this conversation of, you've been getting screwed in your money that's bringing you up. Even if it was less than what those guys were making, but better than $300 a night. He said, well, I don't know what you're complaining about. He said, I reviewed what you're making, $300 a night. He said, that's about what I was making when I was your age, so I don't know what you're bitching about. And I said, well, when you were my age, a hotel room was $15 a night, now it's $150 a night. A rental car was $10, now it's $65 a day plus miles. And what the hell does that have to do with the price of eggs in China? What you were making 30 years ago, you were my age.
And that wasn't with a corporate company.
Right. And so at that point, it became clear that, it was just more push to pull there. And I had gotten hurt in a match. My shoulder had gotten torn up in a match. And I had to go have my shoulder scoped. And it was going to be out for 3 weeks. At most 3 weeks, probably quicker. I was bounced back pretty quickly then. And I went home and had the surgery. And I remember them Dusty calling me and saying, how quickly can you come back? We need you guys to drop the belt. Well, at that time, I couldn't even do this. And my arm was sort of like, I was going to rehab. And I said, there's no way I can do it right now, Dust, but as soon as I can get back, 10 days, 2 weeks, but as soon as I can get back. So they start this Dos Hombres thing. with Ricky and a partner under mask, saying it was Brian, saying it was me and Ricky. And in reality, it was Tom Zank on some tapes, and the others it was Brad Armstrong, which always was odd to me because both of them had little tiny waistlines. I never had a tiny waistline, and they had no similar build. I had no similar build to them at all, you know. And you could look at it and clearly see it wasn't me. You could tell which one was Ricky, and. So I was at a grocery store one night. I used to always go to the grocery store after midnight so I wouldn't get hassled. And I'm walking through, and this guy and I keep passing each other in the aisle. Go to the next aisle, and he's going this way, and I'm going this way. The next aisle, this way, and then this way. And he keeps looking. Every time we pass each other, he keeps looking at me like, I must be a wrestling fan, you know. And he finally, after so many hours, he said, Shane Douglas? I said, yes, sir. And he said, what are you doing here? I said, I'm buying groceries. What are you doing here? He said, I just saw you on TV tonight lose the belt. And I said, I don't think so, because I haven't been anywhere on the road for a while. He said, no, you and Ricky lost the belts tonight. I'm like, what are you talking about? So I called Ricky, and he said, yeah, they had me and I think it was Armstrong that night. And so I went back and looked at the tape, and of course the Shane Douglas those hombres got beat. But Ricky Steamboat, you know, for anybody that's ever watched that segment, they probably have a take. The first thing Ricky does after the bell sounds, he jumps up and he pulls his mask off. And I've had a lot of people say to me, like, boy, he was really trying to bury you there. To the absolute contrary, you know, because the conventional wisdom being he pulled his mask off to show that it wasn't Steamboat that got beat. In reality, what he was doing is he pulled it off to show that's Ricky Steamboat, because that can't be Shane Douglas, and so he would take his mask off too. And I never, to this day, have understood why they couldn't have waited another 2.5 weeks to get back to do it properly. I think it's a lot more impactful to have Shane Douglas get pinned than to have some guy you say is Shane Douglas under a mask get pinned.
In an angle that doesn't make any sense at all.
Exactly. Just again, the politics. And at that time, it's so, you know, I'd been dabbling with this politics stuff and never liked any part of it. And, you know, when I went away and taught, I didn't miss that part of it. And then I come back again, and here it is again, only worse. And that's it. I'm done walking away, you know, with a degree, and I want to go back and get my legitimate full master's, and then go on to get my PhD. I went back and got had a teaching job lined up in social studies, my field, and late 92, early 93, give or take, I can't remember the exact time frame. In that time frame, Eddie Gilbert started calling and said that he was going to work for this promoter in Philadelphia, Eastern Championship Wrestling, and he wanted me to come in. And just having come through this political bullshit with WCW again, I said, you know, Eddie, I'd love to work with you again. I said, but I'm done. I'm getting out of the business. I have no stomach left for it. And a week would go by, and he'd call me again and say, well, how about if we give you this much money instead of that much money? And I said, thank you, Eddie, but it's not about the money. And this went on for several weeks, you know, and him calling me once, twice, 3 times a week, and keep sweetening the deal, and, you know, this and that, and, you know, hey, thanks, but no thanks. I'm done. But thank you for thinking of me. But, you know, finally he said, what if we let you be the lead heel for the company? And I remember thinking on the phone going like nobody's ever offered me that before, you know. And I thought, well, I almost said no, and then I thought, well, it's for a little company in Philadelphia. I mean, how long's it going to go, right? A week, month, 2. And so we agreed on a price, and I said, I'll come out and do it, but if I see any signs of politics, any signs, I'm turning around and walking out the door. And he agreed to that. And I went to Philadelphia, and I remember the first day, Terry Funk and I had flown right around the same time. We were both picked up by the same car, and we were driving over to the hotel, and Terry always called me Shano. He said, well, he was sitting behind me and leaned up and tapped me on the shoulder. He said, well, Shano, how long do you think we'll ride this train before it runs off the tracks? And we sort of joked and laughed about it and thought maybe 2 or 3 months, you know, before we'd be out of business. neither of us, I was still young and dumb to the business, but Terry, who was old and seasoned in the business, he didn't see it going past that either. ECW really did the impossible. It became something. It was one of those things where all the parts of the machine were all lined up perfectly. The stars were all lined up perfectly. The major companies, WCW and WWF, had gone on Cartoon Land. The other smaller companies were falling away. Independents were doing okay business, but there was a place for another company to provide a different product. And it was a very short span, 1 month, maybe 2, that I was here. Eddie had originally called me the Fabulous One. Shane Douglas, like the Fabulous Fargos. And, Eddie was always kindling back to Memphis. And my ring music was "Are You Gonna Go My Way" by Lenny Kravitz. And he gave me a decent little push, but it was just almost shameless as a babyface, pretending to be a heel. It was sort of like wishy-washy, no real direction. I mean, how do what's a fabulous one? It's the 1950s that might have worked, not in the 90s. And we went to a booking meeting one day, and me, Doug Gilbert, Paul Heyman, Todd Gordon, Eddie Gilbert, there were a few other people in there. And after a few minutes, Todd and Eddie got up and walked out of the room. And several minutes went by, maybe a half hour. Todd came back in and called Paul out of the room. And they left for a short while and came back. And Todd said, with Doug Gilbert still sitting there, said, Eddie Gilbert's quit and left the building. Paul Heyman is the new booker. It was that sudden. It was that quick. And we never got a full explanation as to why. Doug, of course, jumped right up, took his stuff, and left. And Paul did the tapings that night. I think that was the night that Paul had introduced me in the ring with Snuka and Morocco and a bunch of other guys in the ring. And shortly after that, at Valley Forge, we were doing a title tournament to decide the ECW champion, my Eastern Championship Wrestling champion. And it was a cage match for the title. And that night in the dressing room, after that match, I'd won. And Paul came to the back and said, "I have an idea for a gimmick for you." In 1993, the NFL had just started delineating one player per year as the franchise player. It was supposedly the most important player, the key player to each team. And Paul said, "I'm thinking about calling you the franchise." Well, at first it sounded odd because, we were just hearing this in the NFL and it seemed almost like we were following and copying. And he said, "I want you to be that arrogant heel." He said, "Put it this way, you're the captain of the football team who steals everybody's girlfriend and fucks them." That was the only direction Paul ever gave me on the character. And I remember thinking to myself, I can play with that. To be that sort of dick in your face, I'm better than you. And then he had, of course, Sherry Martel and Curtis Hughes with me. And that was where the franchise character came from. And the Perfect Strangers did not come till later. That originally was Chris Benoit's ring music. Then when we formed the original Triple Threat, me, Benoit, Malenko, it became the Triple Threats music. They left shortly after to go to WCW, and just by proxy, it became my music. When I would go to the ring, the sound guy, not knowing any better, just kept playing Perfect Strangers. And I liked it a hell of a lot better than I like "Are You Gonna Go My Way?" So that's where that came from. That's how it all started, the franchise character.
And what did you think about Sherry Martel being your manager? She's such a legend in the industry. And a WWE Hall of Famer, I guess, now.
Yes, I had known Sherry for years before that. Always loved Sherry, was always impressed by her work. I've been one of those guys that have never been, shouldn't say never, rarely impressed with women's wrestling. Like when I would watch Moolah as a kid growing up, she looked like a woman pretending to do what guys do, to me, in my opinion, my humble opinion. Sherry was the first woman wrestler that I ever watched that I thought, damn, she's different. She wrestled like a guy. And but when you got to know her in the dressing room, she was such a sweetheart, such a loving person, like your sister, not anything like the character that she played on television. And hopefully I think most people would say that about all of our characters, but Sherry really was dichotomous from the type of character that she played. Really cared about people, was very humble, quiet, but also fun. Like she'd cut up and just like the boys, she liked to have her fun. And for me, I thought it was only a huge benefit to me because Sherry, not that she would often do it. I think she always felt like it wasn't her place to. And I think part of the way the business was at that time, like a woman doesn't tell a man, like, give him any pointers. And I said to her, if you have an idea, shoot it at me. If I ignore it, I ignore it. But if you got one, give it to me. And she would very, very seldom, but would, Shane, why not this? Or Shane, she'd just give. And she was the first one that hit me with the idea of when I was using a second like that, a manager, to have buzz phrases, to draw the ref, or something to draw the attention, or take the camera off of me for a second. She was the one that that taught me that, and I always loved working with Sherry. In fact, when she finally left to go to WCW, I couldn't fault her for doing it because they were obviously offering her a lot more money, but I have to admit there was a part of me that was really sad to see her leave because she was just so great to be around and so fun and easy to work with at ringside.
You're mentioning all the names that were part of ECW at this point. Was it profitable at this point with all those big names now?
No. I think at that point they were still trying, Todd was still trying with Eastern Championship Wrestling to use these stars of yesteryear to pull a crowd in. And there would be some semblance of the crowd that wanted to come see that. What was going to work was you couldn't go if everybody is selling vanilla. You can't go and sell French vanilla and say you're different. It's still vanilla. And the business was all pretty similar flavors of vanilla, just using that flavor as an example. Suddenly ECW came out and was, Rocky Road. It was something completely different. I'm sure it turned a lot of fans off that were used to that traditional wrestling model. But there were also, I think, a lot of fans that had grown so tired of the, Dean Douglases and dead men coming back to life and evil hockey players with one blackened tooth and the evil plumber and just that stupid garbage crap that suddenly here was a company that was talking to you in language that you use at home and on the street, doing things that you'd always hoped for to see. Then it ramped up a violence that had not been seen in American wrestling before. We had heard about this, much like when I was a kid reading the magazines, we had heard about these ultra-violent matches in Japan. But again, you can only imagine, you weren't seeing them again with no live streaming. And suddenly here came ECW giving you something like that. And not just that, but here's Benoit, who played Pegasus Kid in these matches. And here's Sabu, who became a big name over there. Names that we hadn't yet seen on the American scene because they hadn't been overexposed in the WWF and WCW, and now they're here in ECW. And there's Shane Douglas, used to be a World Tag Champion, and there's Sherry Martel, and there was enough there. And each time that Paul would cut one, like a Jimmy Snuka loose, for instance. Nothing against Jimmy. It was just purely just looking at it from a business point of view. If we take Jimmy off and we free up some money to maybe bring in two or three other guys, now you bring in a Dean Malenko and a Chris Benoit, or a Super Crazy and a Tajiri, or a Rey Mysterio, or an Iconium. Each time he would get rid of one of those larger names of yesteryear, he would bring in one of these new names that some segment of the audience was going, man, I would love to be able to see those guys. And here they were for the first time congregating together.
In those early years, Todd Gordon, I guess, was the backer. Where was his finances coming from? Todd's
family owned a jewelry store, a well-known jewelry store downtown Philadelphia. Todd was individually wealthy, but I would imagine much of that wealth was on paper. It wasn't like he's got $10 million sitting in a bank vault somewhere. or some huge corporation that was willing to lend him, whatever money he needed, or the credit to get on a major network. So I've often, in looking back, wondered, how were they able to do this? Because in the early days, first 3 to 6 months, we'll say, the ECW arena was not full. The first couple, I think the first 1 or 2 shows had 2 or 3 rows of people. We were giving out free coupons for free beer and hot dogs. But once that caught, it grew very quickly. It went from that 2 or 3 rows to 75% full, then jam-packed, then turn-away crowds very quickly. But in Jim Thorpe, we were wrestling at the Flagstaff, there's 75 people in the building. Jammed. It wasn't like it was an empty building, but it was tiny. It was not much bigger than this room. And those checks always cleared. We'd wrestle in front of a couple hundred people over the weekend, and my checks would clear. And then much later we'll get to it, I'm sure, the inverse universe, suddenly we're wrestling in buildings in front of thousands of people, sellouts, and the checks are bouncing like rubber balls. But Todd's money came from, as far as I know, from the jewelry store, and I think there was a bit of family money behind it, but certainly wasn't wealthy to the point where he could have floated ECW through years and years of growth.
Right. And a lot of people, including me and a lot of wrestling experts, would say that ECW as Extreme Championship Wrestling really began when you threw the NWA title in the garbage. Could you just detail who came up with that idea and what the whole fallout was from that?
Yes, it was... I don't know if it was all Paul's idea, or if it was Paul and Todd's idea. Paul called me a week or so before the tournament. We were still at that point, Eastern Championship Wrestling was still a member of the NWA. And at that time, we had started drawing those really strong houses, those sellout crowds, and I think we were only an NWA member to be doing that in the States. So they wanted to do the tournament in the ECW arena, and proffered the idea of having Shane Douglas, the ECW champion, become the NWA champion. And Paul called me and laid this idea out to me, which I remember vividly. The first time that he told it to me, it sounded so wrong, like to do that, because it bled so much of the politics that I eschewed in the business. And he, but the one thing I'll say about Paul was he didn't call me and tell me I was doing it. Paul always gave me the option. He would say, we can do this or we can do this. And he would tell you the good and bad of this, and he would tell you the good and bad of this. It wasn't like he'd say, we can do this, which is going to be really great, or we can do this, which is going to suck, but it'll be okay. He would give you all points of view on equal footing. And through the course of the time, that week or two that it was leading up to the tournament, you can imagine in my head, I'm wrestling with this because I, had grown up a fan of the NWA and had huge respect for most of those guys that carried, if not all of them, that carried that belt. And I would go through this, I'm going to do it, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do it, I'm not going to do it. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I couldn't very well call my friends and say, hey, Paul's got this idea. So I was sort of stuck with this just on my own. And Wednesday before the tournament, Mike Tenay had a radio show, nationally syndicated radio show on, and he called me on Thursday and said, did you hear my show last night? I said, no. And he said, I think you got to go back and listen to the archive. I had Dennis Corluzzo on, and he didn't talk very kindly about you. To my knowledge, I'd never met Dennis Corluzzo. I had known the name only because of the hotel where we're staying tonight. The first time I came into ECW, Eddie Gilbert had to run over there to pick up the check from him. And we drove over with Eddie, sat in the car, he ran in and came out. I didn't know what Dennis Corluzzo looked like. I had never met him as far as I had remembered. And why would he, if we're doing this weekend, it didn't make sense to me. So I went back and I listened, and Dennis Corluzzo, remember at this time, we were still making about 75% of our money on independents, about a quarter of ECW. So I listened, and he said on the in the interview, if anybody out there's thinking of hiring Shane Douglas, I wouldn't, because I can tell you at first-hand knowledge, Shane Douglas will take your take your deposit, not show up, and he'll screw you out of the money. And I had never done that to anybody, never. And I thought, why the fuck would he say that? That's the dumbest thing in the world. And at the time, I took it as an overt attempt to take food off my family's table. And it pissed me off. And I thought, so he's politicking on me now, and I don't even know the guy? So if that's what the industry is, I've learned the politics. I know how to do them. I'll play with the best of them. I just choose not to. So I still, of course, after listening to that, that pushed me towards, fuck it, I'm throwing the belt down. But then as I got closer to the day of doing it, I still had great reservations. I got to the ECW arena typically around 12:30, 1 o'clock on a TV day. And I walked through the back door, and this short, heavy-set, sort of odd-looking guy with a funny accent came walking up and shoves a contract in my face. Here, Shane, sign this, man. You gotta sign this, man. I said, who are you? And he said, I'm Dennis Corluzzo, man. Nice to meet you. And he's, I'm thinking, like, what's this guy doing in here, And so I looked at this thing. It's a legitimate contract. And he said, I got signed on the spot. And I said, first of all, I wouldn't sign a contract from God until my attorney reads it, Dennis. So I'll take it on and let my attorney read it. And he proceeded to follow me around the dressing room the entire night. At one point, I came out of a toilet stall, having taken a shit. And he was outside the toilet stall and ready to open the door. He goes, here, Shane, can you sign this, man? I was ready to knock him out. I was really getting pissed. I kept telling Paul, get him the fuck away from me. Because if he keeps shoving that contract in my face, I'm going to knock him out. And so finally, Paul did his best to keep him away from me. I went and dressed under the stairs with Taz and Perry and the guys. I think Bam Bam and Chris. I don't think Bam Bam was there yet. Now I've got 3 matches in the tournament to get through. First with Taz, second with Malenko, and the third with Too Cold. And the building was hotter than hell. Extremely stifling hot, August night. And so I had to get through these matches, and I still hadn't committed to doing it. In fact, when I'm in the match with Scorpio, I know I've got to ultimately make a decision pretty quickly here, and I start doing the promo. And I never pre-planned or wrote any of my promos down. I just spoke off the mind. The whole time I was growing up with my dad was a legitimate superhero. A World War II vet. A decorated hero in the war. He served under Patton's Third Army. 28-inch waist, 48-inch chest. I mean, the guy was built. There's a picture of him from World War II with holding an M60 machine gun and a carbine, and it just looks like G.I. Joe. And watching, he's like a legitimate superhero to me growing up. And he used to tell me from the time I was a kid, and I never knew what he meant. He used to say, son, you can always remember, you can walk with your feet on the ground like everybody else, you can soar with the eagles. And I go, okay, Dad, yeah, that sounds good. No idea what he meant by that. And the moment in that promo where I stopped and I say, here we go, Dad, my dad had just passed away earlier, like a few weeks before. And when I started, here we go, Dad, it was because I could feel my father's presence. And for the first time in my entire life, I realized what my dad was saying. You can go along and do what everybody else does and get what everybody else gets. Or you can take a chance to soar and perhaps do better. And that's when I threw the belt down. As I'm cutting through the promo, the only part of the promo I tried to memorize, not memorize, just I kept going over it in my head, was the long list of names of people that had carried that belt because I didn't want to miss anybody. And after these 3 matches, I'm blown up and it's hot, and I'm trying to remember this promo, and I'm going through it, and luckily the audience starts hitting out names. And Dory Funk, and Terry Funk, the man that'll never die, and Fat Man Dusty Rhodes, and I'm going through it, and it almost lent to the credibility of the reality of the promo, because it was, you could see it wasn't a scripted thing.
Yeah. And
I hadn't yet made eye contact, and the reason I'm dragging this promo out is I'm still in my head going, do it, don't do it, do it, don't do it, do it, don't do it. My biggest hesitation to doing it had nothing to do with being nice or mean to Dennis Corluzzo. I didn't want any of those guys I had just mentioned to think that I was doing anything to shit on their legacy, because it was anything but that. And that's why I said that for a company that died 7 years ago, R.I.P. And that was the only hesitation I had. And as I'm doing that promo, if you watch closely, you'll see my head turned to the left, and Todd was sitting with Corluzzo and Bob Ortiz, our ring announcer, down at the front left corner of the ring. And I made eye contact with Corluzzo, and all I could hear in my head was, he'll take your money and steal your money and fuck you. And that's when I said, he can all kiss my ass, and threw the belt right at him. Thank God it worked. You know, there was no guarantee it would. There was every guarantee that more likely that the fans would go, fuck you, ECW and Shane Douglas. And luckily that more represented the FTW attitude that Taz talked about later at ECW that really set us apart from everybody else. But it could have easily been the epitaph to my career. Thank God it wasn't.
You mentioned that the NWA was dead 7 years before that.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it's still dead, but some people are trying to revive it now. What's your opinion of that?
To me, it's like you can't relive ECW. You can't bring ECW has been gone now for what, 18 years, 17 years, whatever it's been. I don't think, like my kids grew up watching wrestling. They don't know what the NWA is. Yeah, there are a lot of fans out there that still do, but all those fans that do remember it also know that it died a long time ago, and that there's been multiple attempts at reviving it, and none of them work. But with that said, I think our business is in a very precarious place right now. I happen to be in it, thankfully, at a time when it went to levels that nobody could have ever seen coming. 48 to 50 million people per week watching wrestling, and the television, and the WrestleManias, and all these huge pay-per-views, and it was just like a nirvana that a guy like Bruno Sammartino could never have imagined in 1969 or 1970. So to have seen and been in at that time, and then now seen it reduced to 2 to 3 million fans per week for all intents and purposes. My obvious question is, I know ratings are down everywhere, but are they down 96% everywhere? Like, as the NFL used to be drawing 150s in the ratings, now they're only drawing 7s and 8s. I mean, because the wrestling industry is so totally down, and then you take in the fact that 2 of those companies are no longer even around anymore. It's one company that should be drawing even better ratings than they were before. And then when you understand the product that we do, you can see clearly how far it's gotten away from wrestling and to what Vince would call sports entertainment. So with that said, I would hope that the latest attempt to revive the NWA would have, if not great success, some modicum of success. I hope TNA with their new backers, Canadian backers, would get hot. I hope the Ring of Honor would suddenly nail a rating. I'd hope 5 more companies would start up and get hot. I want to see the kids that are in the business today have the same opportunities that I had back then. If, at first when I broke in with the territories, I could get told no 25 times, I still had a chance. Now you get 1 no and you're done. Unless you want to go, dabble around in the business. And how do you build a star dabbling around in the business? So I want to see the business get back to where it's some semblance of that must-see television. It used to be on, Tuesday morning, everybody at school was talking about, hey, did you see what happened on Raw last night? Or did you see what happened on Nitro last night? And then you had the replays. So I would hope that they'd all get hot again. The business, as great as the places that we had seen it go, I don't think anybody, Vince included, could imagine how much of that could be lost. So I agree. I think it's almost impossible to resurrect something. I don't know of any example where something in wrestling had been resurrected from that long ago.
And they can't erase the title holders that have held the NWA title. You were probably one of the last really credible ones.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the lineages since then, but I have read some of the names, and there's nothing on them, even if you Google the names. So
yeah, it's been a shame what happened, because he had so many. I don't know each of the guys, and I don't want to disparage any of them, but there's been so many attempts, and every couple years we hear somebody else is going to resurrect the NWA, and the NWA is coming back. We all know the historic lineage of the NWA, and that will never be erased. All those legendary names. But to keep on saying Shane Douglas is going to buy it tomorrow, now Shane Douglas is NWA, and I'm going to rebuild it, and then after that it's yours, and then after that it's his, and after that it's hers. At some point you just have to say, let it go, and maybe try to build the next big thing. You know, when Eastern Championship Wrestling became Extreme Championship Wrestling, I'm sure there were a lot of wrestling pundits at that time saying, ECW, what the hell is that? Nobody's ever going to get behind that. You know, so there is something will become the next big thing. But I don't think it's going to be by resurrecting something from 2+ decades ago.
Right when you were really hot in ECW, to say the least, you were the franchise, both literally and figuratively. You jumped to WWE. What was the process that led to you making that jump?
There was a long, protracted courting of me, Pat Patterson and Jim Ross calling me. And I was happy in ECW. I wasn't happy teaching. Let me rephrase that. I love being in the classroom teaching the kids. I'm one of those dorks that just loves history and the Constitution and have spent my life learning it. And in a classroom teaching kids that want to learn, that's almost as equal a high as being in front of 20,000 fans screaming. It really is. I had one parent say to me one time, her daughter, she came to me at open house and she said, my daughter has always hated history class. She said, since she's had you, it's her favorite subject. You can't tell a teacher a better thing than that. And I used to get Christmas cards for about 20 years after that. I got Christmas cards from that girl every year. So I do miss that. I don't miss dealing with idiot superintendents that are more worried about kissing some jerk-ass parent their rear end as opposed to educating that child or those children. More afraid of lawsuits than educating. You can't. No success was ever built out of trying to just avoid something. Success is built out of forging forward and leading, and I saw very little of that in education. So I was as happy as I was in ECW. It still wasn't able to pay me the kind of money that at this time I'm really coming into my peak years in the business. And I was making, between ECW and teaching, I was making good money, but I was killing myself to do it. Teaching 5 days a week, doing my lesson plans on Sunday, grading papers every free moment I had somewhere, preparing my lesson plans, going to night school Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, going to the gym every day, sometimes twice a day, renovating a house. I was burning the candle on both ends and 3 places in the middle. So when Jim Ross and Pat Patterson started courting me, I'd had a successful run in ECW. I'd been the champion for some time and had been involved in a lot of the major angles. Excuse me. And Jim Ross, there must have, I didn't want to leave ECW, so I remember there was a lot of, let me think about it. And I kept ending it with that and put it off for a while, and it bought me a week or two. And this went on for several months. Finally, Jim Ross called me and said something that made me think. He said, Shane, sometimes opportunity only knocks once. So I started thinking about it, and I talked about it with my ex-wife, and I thought, well, let's at least go hear out what he has to say. So he flew me up there 5 times before this, and on the 6th time, on the 5th time that I was up there, I said, for some reason, I just couldn't bring myself to sign the papers. I kept saying, let me think about it, and I'll let you know. And on the 5th time, I said in the meeting in Vince's office, Pat Patterson was there and J.J. Dillon was there. He said, I said, and it was bullshit. My ex-wife knew nothing about the business other than her husband was in it. I said, Carl and I share all of our decisions. All of the decisions that we make in wrestling, and almost like good cop, bad cop. So and I said that just this conversation, I said, my wife really loves Broadway plays. So about a month and a half later, Vince calls and says that he wants me and Carl to fly up, and so what the hell, we'll go up and hear what they, finally get to the nitty gritty of it. They fly us up first class. Limousine picks us up at the airport, drives us from LaGuardia to Stamford, Connecticut, to the Titan Towers. We go in, and the whole way up, my ex-wife was not very assertive. She sort of like flew to the back and allowed me to do what had to be done. And I told her on the way up, I said, he's going to ask you And so if he does ask you, and I don't care if he asks you if you're comfortable, I want you to look him in the eye and I want you to tell him whatever is in your head. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't worry about mincing words. Don't try to avoid pissing him off. Say whatever pops into your head. And honest to God, in our entire relationship, the 18 years we were together, I never saw her do it again. But at one point in the meeting, he said, Carla, Troy tells me that you guys share all decisions. I'm sure you must have some questions. Is there anything I can answer for you? And astoundingly, she looked him right in the eye and she said, my husband makes a significant income from ECW. He makes, between that and teaching, he makes a good 6-figure income. He's at home. He loves teaching. He loves ECW. ECW, he's worked for you before. He's worked for WCW twice before. He's worked for the NWA and UWF. Nobody's ever utilized his talents like ECW has. And on top of all that, he's in bed with me 5 nights a week. What could you possibly offer my husband to walk away from all that? Without missing a beat, her hands were like this on the table. He leaned across and he patted her hand. He went, Carla, you have my word as a gentleman to make your husband a very wealthy man. And I jumped in on that. So I said, well, what are we talking about, Vince? Because I'm sure you and I have different definitions for the word wealthy. He said, well, we don't guarantee contracts here in the World Wrestling Federation, but I assure you it's not uncommon for somebody in the position we're going to put you in to make a minimum of $350,000 and $550,000 a year base salary. So I said, okay. So we finished out the meeting, went back. They put us up in the Plaza Hotel and right on what's the park in Central Park, New York, in a suite. $1,500 a night for the room, and we had tickets to the front row orchestra pit seats to see Miss Saigon that night. Really laid the red carpet out. A bottle of Cristal or Dom Perignon champagne in the room, a tray of exotic fruits dipped in chocolate and sprinkled with gold dust. It was really overdone, and really meant, I guess, for me to drop my guard. So when I left, I still didn't sign. I said there was just something in the back of my head that didn't feel right. So I left and I called Ricky Steamboat, Sherry Martel, Jake Roberts, Joe and Mike, the Road Warriors, Rick Rude, Perfect, Big Boss Man, everybody that I had known and was close with and had made, big money up there. And every single one of them told me the same thing. They said, that's what he told us and we got rich. So I dropped my guard. I was being paranoid. Dropped my guard and signed. And it wasn't 2 weeks into my run that I thought I made a fucking mistake. What did I sign here for? It was just a really, really bizarre time. I've often said, and I stand behind it, the worst 6 months of my entire 38 years in the business. I wouldn't do it again and wouldn't advocate doing it again. It was the shits.
When they were courting you, were they telling you about this Dean Douglas gimmick, or did they only bring this up after you were signed?
No, they. Where the Dean Douglas gimmick came from was they took me into a boardroom with a bunch of writers sitting down at the other end of the table, the long table. They made me take my shirt off. Now, all these women out there saying they were sexually harassed. Okay, I guess me too. Because they made me take my shirt off and I had to stand there and slowly turn in a circle and keep flexing for these guys as I turned in a circle. Very strange. And they're reading my resume. And of course, the thing that sticks out is I've been a teacher. I've got 2 master's equivalencies and was accepted to medical school. And so he's a pretty smart guy. So somebody said, let's make him the evil teacher. And they started kicking this idea around, and then somebody said, no, he's got to be collegiate. He's a professor. No, he's a, and they kept ramping it up, and then finally somebody said, he's a dean. And because of Shane Douglas, then somebody, you can just see the brain work here. It's Dean, and another name with D is Dean Douglas, and the world's smartest man. And then they kept going like so far past the point. He's got a PhD. No, he's got 7 PhDs. He's the world's smartest man. It was just like watching an evil scientist at work. Like, let's see how crazy we can make this. It was just overkill. And the franchise character, to me, what made it work was that there was a connection between the things that Shane Douglas, the franchise, was saying, looking into that camera lens and talking to somebody at home. and making a point, shooting on Ric Flair, shooting on the WWF, shooting on Hulk Hogan, things that every fan was thinking that nobody had ever said, was always taboo. So the franchise was really the first real shoot character after wrestling had gotten huge, and realism. And suddenly here he is, this cartoon character in Powder Puff Baby Blue, and not allowed to use voice inflection, even though his promos were renowned for heat. The world's smartest man, 7 PhDs. He's smarter than everybody on the planet. Nobody
tried that with Lenny Poffo.
right, and then that I don't know if maybe they had a run. Like Vince bought a great big truck full of baby blue out material or something. But remember, you had Louis Piccoli was in Powder Puff Baby Blue. Then the Body Donnas were in Powder Puff Baby Blue. Then they put me in Powder Puff Baby. I don't know if Vince thinks that Powder Puff Baby Blue strikes fear in the hearts of men or something, but it's sort of lacking something. And almost the biggest mistake, I sort of throw this in there for clarity on everything that I made in that whole deal, was I could not imagine anybody seeing Shane Douglas as anything other than the franchise by that point. In '96, I was really one of the hottest heels in the industry, and I went to Vince and I had trademarked and copyrighted the franchise Shane Douglas, the Triple Threat, and I said to him, why not just let me be the franchise? That's what everybody knows and expects of me. That's what's comfortable for me. We can put a bunch new, of parameters to the character and add to it, but build on that base. And in lieu of that, I'll sign, because I knew that everybody said that if he didn't create it. And I said, in lieu of that, I will sign the copyrights over to you for the length of the contract. Thank God he said no, because had he not, when I left, I'd had to go back and been Joe Blow the plumber. It was thank God that Vince's narcissism led him to screw himself and keep me from screwing myself.
Now, you ran into some issues with the Clique. We use Quebecer Pierre on our events in Canada where we run. He's our champion now.
Yeah,
but,
great guy.
I've heard you tell the story about him.
Yeah, true story.
Do you want to just talk about the difficulty that the Clique was to deal with at that time?
Well, understand that, two of the members of the Clique I had long relationships with. Scott Hall and Shawn Michaels were in WWF in 1990. Me, Shawn, Marty, and Dustin. Everybody called us the Four Amigos. Where you saw one of us, you saw all four of us. And we were inseparable. When they came to Pittsburgh, I would give them the key to my brother's house. My brother was a set designer in Hollywood. He had this big house up on the hill, and the fridge was always stocked, and several rooms. And I'd give him the key, and I'd go to my little apartment. I'd say, "Go, Hank, it's your home. Make yourself at home." And you do that for me. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, things turn around and I'm in a position you're coming in. You don't have to ask her. It's done. If you take care of me, that's just the way I am. So I didn't expect Shawn to become the shithead that he did. And the same thing with Scott was that when Johnny and I were together as the dudes, he always had money for pot. He always had money for pills, but he rarely had money for gas or rental car or hotel room. And Johnny would always say, just jump in with us, Same thing with Shawn. You do that for me, allow me to buy my pot and my pills and don't expect me to pay for the room and whatever else. I'm going to take care of you down the road. So I dropped my guard with both of those guys because I didn't expect there to be any issues. I just counted them as friends. Kevin and I, Nash, had known each other in '93 in WCW. I always got along fine with Kevin. Same thing with Hunter. Never had any issues with Hunter. And I didn't really know Sean Waltman. I'd seen him here and there and never had any real issues with him. And I remember one of the first, remember there was like a month and a half period where the Dean character was doing just vignettes from the studio. And one of the first shows that I did on the road was in Lansing, Michigan. Bill Watts was in booking at that time. And they called me and Scott Hall Sean Waltman, Bob Backlund. They called us all to the first aid room in the arena, in the Lansing Arena. And it was a long, thin room. The gurney was turned sideways at the end, and then, a couple cabinets and stuff, like a first aid station. And Scott was sitting on the gurney, and he's sort of playing drums. He had a good old time. Big smile on his face. The rest of us come walking in, and Bill's standing there, and he's got a clipboard. And he goes, "Okay, guys, in the segment whatever tonight, Shane, it's going to be you versus Scott." And he's talking the whole time. Scott's doing this stuff, and Bill stops about halfway through, and he goes, "Shane, what do you use for a finish?" As soon as he said that, Scott went, stopped beating the drums, and he went, "Whoa." And I remember vividly seeing that and thinking, well, I just have to go out and bump my ass off for him, and we'll figure something out that makes sense. And I had been around the business long enough to know, and trained by the right people, that if you start stuttering stepping me or lead-assing me going up for a slam or whatever, you don't need to do it twice. I know as soon as you start doing what you're doing, and I'll just try to overcompensate. But in the long run of it, it's going to make the match look like shit. And I would think that anybody like Vince or anybody that's been around the business for any length of time would be able to clearly watch a video. I could watch any video and go, this one or that one is causing it. You can clearly see it. And it was pulling teeth that night with Scott. And there was a lot of that up there. A lot of this, like this boo-boo face, if like somebody had to do a job or whatever. And then there were like little comments. I remember one night, Scott, I was being very careful with my punches and stuff. I did, in ECW, we laid stuff in pretty solid. And I didn't want to get a reputation up there and, bust somebody, hard way somebody or whatever, and all of a sudden, oh, he's the dangerous guy to work with. So one night, Scott came back in front of the dressing room. He said it loud enough for everybody to hear, and I guess in order to try to embarrass me, he thought. He said, Dean, us WWF guys, we're every bit as tough as you ECW guys. You don't have to worry about pulling your shit, brother. With me, lay it in. Okay, got it. The next night, I went out and did exactly what we would do in ECW. I didn't stiff him. I didn't potato him. I snugged it like we would in ECW. Never once in ECW, whether it was Taz, Bam Bam Bigelow, or Francine or Bill McGillicuddy, not one time did I ever have anybody complain in ECW. And the very next night, Scott Hall comes back into the dressing room. He goes, Dean, I know what I said last night, but goddamn, you didn't have to kill me out there. I was like, well, which is it? Are you guys as tough as the ECW guys? Because that's how we did it in ECW. Or do you want me to just pull my shit and take it real? I can do either way. And I just remember thinking to myself how embarrassed I was for him that he would do that. Like, you think you're trying to make fun of me in the dressing room, but you just made yourself look like a pussy. And it was clear from then there was a lot of tension, and it was building. Then they had a segment where Vince had already told me and Sean, he told us together, what the angle was going to be. He wanted to be a repeat of the Rick Rude Ultimate Warrior match, where Rude beat him, or I would beat Sean for the Intercontinental belt, and then at WrestleMania, it would be Chin Music for the world title. And I was fine with that. It's a great build-up, and Sean's an incredible worker. Why can't we make this work? So we were in Valparaiso, Indiana, and they put me and Sean in a dark match at the very outset of the show. Bill was right back at the gorilla position. And 17,000 people, I remember the place was sold out. And we circle around each other, we go to lock up, and right as we go to lock up, Sean takes a flat back bump, and he's laying in the middle of the ring laughing. And I knew right now Bill Watts is having a stroke in the back. So I looked at him and I said, unless you want to get your ass stretched, you best get back to your feet to fucking wrestle. And he jumped up and he kept going, take it easy, Dean, take it easy. He's just ribbing you. Well, I don't take that as a rib. If you're out in front of if you want to rib, let's rib me in the dressing room. Rib me at the hotel. Don't come out here in front of 17,000 people and expose the goddamn business and say it's a fucking rib. If you want to do it in your match, you're fine, but don't do it in mine. And so I came back to the dressing room first. I was pissed because every time I'd call something, I'd say like clothesline, I go to backdrop, and I go clothesline, goddammit, and the whole match was like that, very choppy. I come to the dressing room first, and I was pissed. And Bill Watts, I turn the corner, and Bill goes, I don't want to hear. It was the only time I ever talked back to Bud. I don't want to hear a fucking word. I said, talk to your golden boy. And walked right past him. At the In Your House in Regina is when we were supposed to do this.
Winnipeg, you mean?
No, it was Regina.
Okay.
It was Regina. It was in your house.
Oh, okay.
It's Manitoba, isn't it? Regina, Manitoba?
Oh, no. I think you went to Regina the next night, that tour, because I think Manitoba is Winnipeg, Regina, Saskatchewan. They did like Winnipeg, Regina, Saskatoon after.
Okay, whichever one it was the In Your House show when he was supposed to drop the belt.
Yeah.
I was in Germany on that loop for 3.5 weeks before that. And while we were in Germany, we got this story that Sean had been attacked by like 15 or 18 or 20 people, some like crazy number. Well, anybody that knows Sean knows he's not a fighter. So Rick Rude's a tough guy. You knew Mike Hagser was a tough guy. Sean's not a fighter. Yeah. And so to hear this, I'm like, something not adding up. It took that many people to beat Shawn Michaels up. And we got back, and now remember, we had told both of us I already had the plane ticket to fly in on Tuesday to there, and because Vince, me, and Sean were supposed to be in to go to work this week on the finish for that match, for him dropping the belt to me, and I get a phone call the day after I got back from Germany from Davey Boy, and Davey Boy said, "Did you hear about Sean?" I said, "Yeah." And I said, "What the hell's going on?" He said, "Well, what you heard is bullshit." He said, and he told me the whole story. Sean was drunk and was getting a little bit forward with a girl that was dating a Marine or married to a Marine. The Marine was there with some buddies, and Sean got a little bit lippy and mouthy, so Davey Boy and X-Pac decided to get him out of there. As they're driving out in the parking lot, as luck would have it, the Marine and this girl are standing there in the front of the bar. Sean rolls his window down and starts running his mouth. The Marine grabbed him, pulled him through the window, beat the shit out of him. Davey Boy jumped out of the car, put the car in park, jumped out of the car and came around the car, and all the guy's friends jumped on him. Davey sort of black eye and bruises and scratches. I get a phone call from, Davey Boy said to me, Sean's been running his mouth about you the whole time you've been in Germany. I said, "What's he been saying?" He said, "He's been telling everybody he's going to embarrass you on the pay-per-view." I said, "Well, if he tries, I'll stretch his ass." That was all it was said. And I knew Davey Boy was stirring the shit because I knew Davey would love to rib. So I get a phone call the next day or the day after that, like a day or two later, from J.J. Dillon saying, you don't need to fly in to Regina early now. You can just, come in on Saturday. I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Well, there's not going to be a match. Sean's had a relapse of his concussion." Now remember, I was accepted at medical school, so I know you don't relapse a concussion unless you get hit in the head again. And I said, "Well, how did he get hit in the head again?" He said, "Oh, he didn't get hit again, he just had a relapse." I went, "Okay." Ding, the light bulb went on. Now I got the full picture here. So I fly in, last flight, me and Jim Cornette were on the last flight in. I get to the hotel, I was room with Dustin Rhodes, and I went up to the room, and Dustin had a note on the bed or the counter saying, everybody's down in the bar waiting for it, for everybody. So I got my stuff put away, and I went down to the bar, and the bar was packed, wall-to-wall people, fans and boys. And as I walked in, I saw this. So I started looking, and it's Scott Hall waving me over. And that's strange, because Scott and I weren't exactly buddies at that time. So he told me he's got a seat for me, so I was walking over, and if you knew anything about Scott, was when he's drinking, he couldn't keep the secret to save his life. So I walked over and sat down next to him, and he said, "I just want to tell you congratulations." I said, "For what?" He said, "Well, you didn't hear it from me, but you're getting the belt tomorrow." Now, where I come from in the business, if you and I have an angle, and the only other person that should know should be Vince. Nobody else besides me, you, and Vince should know what's going on to that. And I said, "Well, I heard Sean's not working." He wouldn't say anything more. He's like give me that routine. And so I get to the building the next day. I have no idea what's waiting for me there, but I get to the building the next day, and right as I pull in, Sean pulls in next to me. Now remember, we've heard this story. He's been beaten up by 325 people. I'm expecting to see him like Davey Boy, bruised up and black eye and that kind of. He's out of the car. He looks fresh as a daisy. Okay, that was strange. So we get out and we walk in, and as I even said something to him like, "Hey, I had a tough time in Rochester." And he goes, "Yeah." We walk in. I go left into the dressing room. He goes into the makeup room. About a half hour later, I go out to go to the catering. He comes out of the makeup room, and he's got the contact lens in them. And I made a comment on, "Well, makeup girls must be tough." And he goes, "Yeah," and chewing his gum, goes on about his business. I'm like, okay, what the fuck is going on here? So I go down to catering. I still have no idea what the match is going to be. Sean's not wrestling. How am I getting the belt? And they send for me to go meet with Vince. So I go into Vince's room. Vince always had, like in that case, whatever the local hockey team was, that was Vince's office. Only Vince could dress in the local hockey team's dressing room. But when I walked in, there were no other lights except the one security light in the locker room. So it's pitch black except for this one light over this table that Vince is sitting at. So I go walking in, and Vince starts laying out the bullshit. You've been a fantastic employee. I appreciate everything you've done here. You're so great at getting heat. He's going through the whole thing, and he starts telling me about how, unfortunately, before we even got to talking about the match, he said to me, we believe that the fans should always go home happy. And I said, well, that's where I would disagree with you. I said, I've seen firsthand in my career that a heel going over sometime with some heat forces those fans back next time. And he stuck to his guns and said, well, we understand it, but that's how things run here. Like, it's an alternate universe, like physics fall up there. And so he starts to tell me what he has in mind, and he said, I'm sure you heard about Sean, and he's not going to be wrestling today, but so I want you to get out of the ring, and you cut one of those promos you do to get that heat that you're so so great at getting. And he said, then Sean's going to come down in his street clothes, he said, and forfeit the belt to you. And I went, oh, please don't do that, Vince. He said, why not? I said, my entire career since I've been old enough to understand what I've been watching, I've heard champions say, you'd have to pry this belt from my cold, dead hands. I'll spill blood, sweat, and tears, or it's like a little bump on that, then I'll stand it over to you. I said, if you want, have him come out and chin music me. He can pin me in the middle of the ring. That's fine. But don't do that. That's what we have to do. And now we've been sitting here talking for 45 minutes at this point. Back and forth, he and I sitting from here to the cameras away. Then he goes, then at that point he goes, you take that belt from Sean. And then at that point, he was like, so I'm staring at him, I'm like, what's he fucking doing with his hand? So I follow his hand down, and I keep going. And sitting over here in one of the lockers, in the shadows, is Scott Hall, who's been listening to this conversation the entire time. And I looked back at Vince and I thought, what kind of fucking game are you playing here, dude? Like, what's the big secret of hiding Scott? Like, do you expect me to say something bad about Scott? If I did that, I wouldn't back it up anyway, or try to say I didn't say it. It was just very strange to me. And he then said to me, whatever finish you want to do. So there's only one that makes any sense. Draw the belt. Otherwise, the fans are going to clearly see you were just taking it from babyface to babyface, which does Scott no good. It does Sean no good. It certainly does me no good. And so I suggested the finish where he pins me. I slide my leg under the bottom rope, and which should have broken the count. It gives me something as a heel to fire back on heat from. Here's my point, legitimate point. And he said, great, we'll do that. But if you go back and watch the commentary, nobody ever comments on that. The camera never cues in on it. It's just typical political bullshit from WWF. The click thing, and like the story you said about
Quebec or
Pierre.
Jean Pierre.
Jean Pierre. Is that story is 100% true. Everything I said, and I've said that, told the story for years. I argue with anybody that say they've heard version A, version B, version C. I remember it as vividly as if it was yesterday.
His career never recovered from that, actually.
Exactly, and he had done the right thing. He had brought the house up, and had they done a hot finish there with Kevin with that title, it would have probably doubled the house the next time. Instead, the Clique wanted to get their way and got it, and screwed him, screwed his family, and did nothing for Montreal. So, Vince, who did you really help?
So you left WWE shortly after that. You went back to ECW, and there ended up being numerous pay issues as time went on in ECW.
Not immediately. When I first went back, it was almost like Paul was like giving me a receipt. Okay, you left, now we're going to make you earn your spot back. And I was fine with that. I didn't want to, nor should I have been able to walk right back into a top spot. But and it also was less pressure for me. Didn't have to worry about worrying if the house was packed. That's Ravens or somebody else's concern now. But Paul, for a long time, wouldn't even talk to me. Give me like the cold shoulder, like middle school. And I had a lot of fun when I first went back. I was thrilled to be back home, first of all. And coming back in as a heel, it allowed me to play up off the heat for leaving to go to WWF. So it was easy. The first thing that I did when I got back, though, was I was at the Lost Battalion Hall in Queens. They had the show, and I wasn't on it. I just was there, like, watching. And afterwards, we're doing promos. And Francine and the Pitbulls got up, and Franny was wearing the leather bondage outfits, and she looked so uncomfortable on camera. Her voice was wavering, and she's shaking. And so I pulled her aside. I'd never met Fran. It was the first time I met Francine. She wasn't there when I'd left. And I took her and walked her over to the corner, and I said, why are you so nervous? And she said, I'm giving her pointers. And I said, look into the camera, just feel it on. You're talking to friends. Are you like everybody? Is anybody in the room here that makes you uncomfortable? No. I said, well, you're talking to us. Just talk to me, and I gave her pointers, and Paul saw that. Paul saw me giving her those pointers and instantly came up with this idea of putting the two of us together. And that's where the Francine the Francine Shane Douglas connection came from when I came back. And it was so perfect because it validated the thing that Vince or Paul had originally told me, the captain of the quarterback of the team, the captain of the football team that steals everybody's girlfriend. And Franny, who was really pretty new to the business, really took to it like a fish to water. She really did pick it up quickly. But remember, though, she was stepping in at a point with somebody that had really been around the business, had been taught from some of the best: Bill Watts, Dusty Rhodes, Eddie Gilbert, Paul Heyman, Dominic DiNucci, Bruno Sammartino. And suddenly she's here and on a night-to-night basis getting hours of talks about why you do it this, don't do that, turn this way, not that way, and explaining the psychology to her. So Franny really picked it up quickly and did great with it. If you look at that very first time when she turns and she takes the thing off, she still looks uncomfortable, like not quite in her element. But then you go back and see her doing things later, like when she walked across the ring and dropped down and slinked across the ring and slid up my leg to kiss the belt. Perfect, Francine. I mean, you couldn't have scripted it better than that. I didn't tell her to do that. That was her. And it was so perfect for that. And what we couldn't do is Paul didn't want us to let anybody know that it was work. I was married. Franny and I were always just professionals. There was never anything other than a professional relationship there. But she had, I'd made her stay in the room with me because if she stayed with Beulah, then everybody would know why, and she was Shane. And it worked to the point where Taz later, like after about a year and a half, Taz and Perry and a couple of the guys pulled me aside and, said, you're a fucking hypocrite. I said, well, okay, well, I'll bite. What makes me a hypocrite? Did you always talk about how much you love your wife, and every weekend you come out and you and Francine? Yeah, you're right. You caught me red-handed. Because Paul didn't want to take the sheets. He didn't want Meller or Kelcher to get it, and Keller or Meltzer to get it, and stooge it out to everybody that it was just a gimmick, which I think would have taken a lot of the glare off of that. We do the hold the ropes and the chest beat and her take the cock walk, things like sliding up my leg to kiss the belt, all those vignettes that we did. If you watch those vignettes back and tell yourself this was all just a gimmick, and then you watch it, some of the magic just falls away. But you look at it and say, Shane Douglas, you think was fucking around on his wife, and watch those and go, takes on a whole life of its own, which is the way an angle should be done.
And you're very remembered for that time for your promos on Ric Flair.
Dick Flair.
Yeah, how much of that was shoot, and when you went back to WCW in your last run there, did you ever have a confrontation with him?
Yeah, not a confrontation, a meeting. What I said about Rick, I stand behind. I've seen that Rick, and I'll clarify in a second, he's gone out and said that I went up to him and said that it was all a work. No. What I told you, Rick, was that it became a work after about the second year. I kept going to Paul and saying, please give me something else to talk about. The reason I started shooting on Rick in the first place, and it backfired, was that outside of Charlotte, his home, and Chicago, Philadelphia was probably his third most over town. They loved and adored Ric Flair in Philadelphia. Well, we were getting a mixture of responses. Franny was getting, she's a pretty good looking girl. Bam Bam was getting that sort of applause. Candido was getting that sort of golf applause in between, and we couldn't get that real solid "fuck you" guys that we were looking for. And so I thought, well, if I go out in Philadelphia where they love and adore Ric Flair and start shitting on Ric Flair, it'll put heat on me. It didn't work that way. When I come back and all of a sudden people are holding up signs, Flair is dead, and long live the new Nature Boy franchise, was not what I was going for. But everything that I said was said because of things that happened with Rick, the politicking and the continual, like when he was head of the booking committee. Nothing I can do about the name, Shane. It's completely out of my hands, because I'm sure Rick or Jim Herd would have never listened to anything Ric Flair had to say. And I watched him systematically when he did the angle with Brian Pillman, when Pillman first came in. You go back and look at that closely. He wasn't doing anything to get Brian over. He was doing to get a great match for himself, because at the end he was going over. And there's a difference. There's a stark difference. Our business is predicated off when you've had your run and it's that time, you graciously pass that torch to the next and explain, teach that guy how to draw, so that you can collect money off of him drawing now, or her drawing. I never saw that from Rick. And so I fired on him and said things that I fervently believe, and I stand behind him to this day. After a year and a half or 2 years, whatever it was, period, where it was obvious to the ECW fans that Rick was not coming, couldn't come, although there was a point when he almost did. I couldn't keep it. It almost looked disingenuous of me to keep calling out a guy that I knew wasn't coming. So I went to Paul and said, please give me something else to talk about. I've got to have something else. And he goes, no, it's keep firing on Rick, keep firing on Rick, keep firing on Rick. And I didn't want to, not out of any love or care for Rick. I needed something more to talk about, something new. And so it was what Rick has said, that I went to him and said it was all a work. No, it was not all a work. It became a work at a point after it had run its course, and it was time for me to say something else. But what the fans don't know, and I've talked about this before, was that right around the time that Arn Anderson came in, there were discussions for there to be a match between Rick and I in ECW. It was around the time that he was having his trouble with Bischoff and his contract. And Arn told Paul that Rick said he'll come in, one time, put Shane over, but he needs it was like $150,000, I think, or $100,000, some six-figure number, which was like $100 million to us. We couldn't afford that. And I knew that Arn kept asking questions of like, what guarantees does Rick have that Shane won't, shoot on him or whatever? And I said, look, come on. I mean, if I'm gonna, if we're gonna fight, I'll fight him in the back. So I suggested to Paul and Arn to offer him a 3-match deal where I would lose to him first in Charlotte. Pretty gracious for the young franchise to go in his backyard and get pinned. He comes to Pittsburgh, loses to me. Now we come to Philadelphia and do a pay-per-view. And, so I'm as much as I can giving it up first, and if that, someone like Rick would clearly understand what that meant. And it would have been a lot more money than $100,000 too, because it was going to be something like 10% of the pay-per-view and the live gate, which I think had we done that, we could have sold out the Spectrum. Right after that, I forget how long it was, but there was still a point where they were having trouble with his contract, and it was going to happen, and all of a sudden he re-signed and stayed, and that killed the idea forever. But when I went back to WCW, Bischoff was very gracious. I've been pretty outspoken against both WWF and WCW. And Bischoff, he could have called me and said, like Vince did. Vince offered me $115,000. So I told Vince. And Bischoff called, actually Dusty Rhodes called me and said, back to Tenay, before Dusty. Tenay called me and said, did you hear my show last night? Dusty was on, and he really put you over on the show. Now, Dusty and I had some heat. So I went back and listened, and he said, Shane Douglas is the Ric Flair of his generation. So I called Dusty to thank him. And I said, I know there's been some heat between us, Dust, and I'd said some things. I said, but what you said last night, I really appreciate that. Thank you. And he said, have you signed with Vince yet? I said, not yet. Why? And he said, do you mind if I bring your name up at a booking meeting? I said, no, knock yourself out. Within a matter of 72 hours, I had talked to Bischoff. He brought my name up. Bischoff inquired, called me, and I had a 3-year, 7-figure income. Consider that I was $144,000 in the hole from ECW, and a lot of that money I'd spent out of my pocket for ECW. That saved my financial life. And I was thankful to Bischoff and WCW for it. And Bischoff knew that there was draw between me and Ric Flair. Every wrestling fan knew there was legitimate heat. So I signed and went, and I took my wife, because I knew I was going to be busy for 3 years. I took her on a 2-week cruise. We came back into Florida, and instead of flying home, I put us up we just jumped around Florida for a couple days. They were going to be in Jacksonville that Monday. So we ended up in Jacksonville. I left Carl at the hotel because I figured I had some politics to take care of, and I had to talk to Rick. So I walk into the building. If you've ever been to the Jacksonville arena, there's, they've got the big regular garage door, and then there's a door about this wide and a hallway about this wide where you have to walk past almost like a bank teller, to get through this hallway, and you can sort of turn sideways and squeeze through. Well, I get in, and everybody's walking around the backstage area, and, Sandman was there at the time, Peaches was there, Mikey Whipwreck was there, and plus, a lot of guys I'd known, like Hugh Morris and Sting and Steiner and Rude. And so all these guys are coming by, and I'm saying hello to everybody. Nobody said anything. I felt Ric Flair walking behind me. And before I even turned around, I went, Rick, how are you? And sure enough, he's standing right there behind me. And he goes, how are you, sir? And he puts his hand out, and I shook his hand. And he went to walk away, and I didn't let go of his hand. I pulled him back. I said, I really think you and I should talk, don't you, Rick? And I wanted to say that in front of everybody to put him on the spot. Otherwise, he'd just say, nah, fuck you. And he looked around, and he said, yeah, give me 15, 20 minutes to settle in. So I went down to catering, and intentionally took 45 minutes because I wanted to give him time to think about it. So I went back up and I knocked on the door. He said, come on in. I opened the door, and he was sitting there in his undertights. He had one boot on and laced, and the other one he was lacing. He jumped up holding the laces, and he came over. He said, I just want to start by saying I'm sorry. Because we had both said some pretty stiff things about each other. And I said, I'm not going to accept that, Rick. I said, because I know it's not genuine. I said, but I'm not going to apologize to you because you would know it's not genuine. I said, but that's exactly why I think this can work. And I said, so I'm looking in the eye and ask you, as a man and as a professional, are you going to do everything you can to uphold this angle? Because I really believe it could help turn WCW back in #1. And he agreed, and he said, yes, sir, yes, I do. That was exactly what he said to me. I said, I'm going to hold you to that. Afterwards, I found out from people in the office that almost from that day forward, he went to work politicking. And so when the ultimate match finally came up, after I did all these things, them jumping him and doing all these screws and really making him a babyface, the reason, if you look back at the match, David Flair was involved, Vince Russo was involved. There was all this people, the dog and pony shit show running in.
Was Vince Russo booking at that time?
Yeah, him and Bischoff. They were doing the co-booking thing.
Oh, okay. So ultimately, it was a disappointment for you from as good. It wasn't in Philadelphia either, was it?
No, it was in Kansas City a few months after Owen Hart had fallen to his death.
So just to quickly sum up your time in WCW, I guess it was a financial benefit, but it's not really the most satisfying professional.
No, the stuff, again, back to the politics, that how many times we've heard that in this interview. I remember watching, they'd have the board set up in the back with 2 or 3 hours worth of tapings, and Kevin Nash would walk in and he'd walk over and look at it, and he'd erase this match and this match and this match, and he'd write whatever matches he wanted in. And then Scott Hall would walk in and he'd erase this match and this match and this match, and he'd write in whatever he wanted. And then somebody else would erase whatever. If I'm booking a show, if you're booking a show, if God is booking a show and writes out a card and he comes in and erases what matches he doesn't like, and then he does and you do and she does and I do, all of a sudden that those cards no longer carry what whoever booked it intended. And I remember just watching that and thinking, why doesn't somebody tell them, sit the fuck down, put it back the way it was? And there was none of that. And then, you know, the stuff that happened when they started the Millionaires versus the New Blood. That was the angle that I thought really had the ability to turn things back in WCW's favor. Because keep in mind, they had, you know, some really incredible people: Benoit, Malenko, Conan, Raven, Vampiro, Rey Mysterio, me, so bad with names anymore. You know, enough people there, you know, enough talent on that New Blood that had the Millionaires Club done what they should have done and passed us. So that doesn't mean getting beaten every match. It doesn't mean okay, Shane, you go out and beat Ric Flair, then you go out and you beat Hogan, and you go out and you beat him, and you go out and beat him. No, you build those angles and do them properly. That really could have turned the course back to WCW, I believe. And yet instead, we saw all those same politics, like when Hogan refused a job for Jarrett, and you know, it just the craziness ensued. The politics were always the problem in WCW from the time that Time Warner took over.
Were you still under contract when they went out of business?
I was. I got caught, I think it was for 28 more months, I believe 24 or 28 months left. What I couldn't understand when that happened was that for the first time in wrestling history in America, was that Vince McMahon now had the opportunity to have a legitimate World Series or Super Bowl of wrestling. And that was the rumor we were hearing at the time. At Owen Hart's funeral at the wake, what we had been hearing was that they were going to angle light characters. So Ultimate Warrior would be against Sting. Shane Douglas would be against The Rock, both white guys. This one would be against this one. This one would be against that one. And I think they really could have built something out of that. You know, for years there were always those, you know, in the magazines, you know, what if Bob Backlund wrestled Ric Flair? What if Bruno Sammartino wrestled Harley Race? What if? For the first and only time in wrestling history, Vince McMahon had the ability to live out the what if and chose not to.
And I won't go into your TNA run because we're running out of time, but overall, are you happy that Dixie Carter's out of power there? Because I understand you didn't have a good experience.
What a missed opportunity. You know, to start a wrestling company, today especially, it takes a fuckload of money, and it takes a fuckload of talent, and it takes a great network, and it takes a lot of luck. She had the money. She had as much money, if not more, to compete with Vince than Vince had, with Panda Energy being behind her. Talent. You go through that dressing room, the people they had in that dressing room over the course of time.
More star power at one point than WWE had.
By far. Then you look at the people they had there behind the scenes. You know, a litany of people, knowing what's up and what's down, knowing how to move this company forward. At no time did she ever take any of it that I was ever aware of. She used to come to me, I was the head of talent relations. She used to come to me every week and say, Vince Russo wants to do this in this match. What do you think? And I'd look at it and think, well, I know where the storyline's been. And I'd say, well, if you do that, then you're going to have to turn this guy heel because, and I'd explain it. And then if you don't do that, then 2 weeks down the road, you're going to have to do that. And I would explain the psychology and everything to her. Not one time in 5 years did she ever take my advice. 2 weeks later, or 2.5 weeks later, we'd come back to do that taping. She would say, you're right. The fans are shitting all over it. To her, that was the 23 people that was on the internet talking about TNA on a blog somewhere. 23, the fans are all shitting on it. Then you'd give that advice to her, and she wouldn't take that advice. The first night, I guess this sums it all up as to why TNA never ever worked. The first night I met Dixie Carter, she was introduced to us. I walked down to the green room after the production meeting, and she followed me into the green room, knocked on the door, and I brought her in, and she said, my father, and she started reciting my resume to me like I didn't know it. And she said, my father's very impressed by what you've accomplished in your career, and he's happy to have you here, and he wants me to ask you for one, if he wanted to ask you for one piece of advice as he's about to start on this, what would be the most important thing you could tell my father? I went, whew, one piece of it, Dick says, I could give you a million pieces of advice. And we started just sitting there talking and bullshitting for a few minutes as I'm thinking in the back of my head, what one piece of advice, one piece? And it finally popped in my head. I thought, if I could only give one piece of advice to your father, the most important piece of advice I could give him would be to in no way, shape, or form try to challenge Vince McMahon right now. Don't try to be the WWF 2, WWF Junior, WWF Light. Be TNA. Be the original TNA. And I said, and then where I made my mistake was, I continued on, I said, like ECW, we went for the 18 to 49 male demographic, while Vince went for the tweeners. And we owned them. And I said, there were less of them, but their money was as green as anybody's. No sooner did I finish that sentence, and here was Dixie Carter's response. Why would we want to copy ECW after all they failed? And no sooner did she finish that sentence, the show had already started, the monitor's behind me. Dixie's standing over here in the doorway, the monitor's behind me. Whatever happened in the arena, the crowd starts chanting, ECW, ECW. So I didn't even answer, I just stepped back. I looked at the monitor, and I looked back at Dixie. I looked back at the monitor, and I looked back at Dixie, and went right over her head. How could you be in professional wrestling and believe that ECW was a failure? Financial, yeah, and for a million reasons. But you don't hear fans chanting WWF or NWA today, and you never will. You still hear them chanting ECW almost 20 years after its demise. That sums it up to me about as much to show you it's hard to be more clueless than that. And Dixie Carter was that.
And just to finish up, I think we may have to do a part 2 with you at some point, because we only scratched the surface. But you now have a podcast, the 3-Man Power Trip. How can people listen to that?
Well, we've been getting some really good feedback. I know for a period of, I think, 2 weeks, we were number 1 on Podomatic. It's taken us some time, and we continue to grow each week. It started off on one outlet, what's the word I'm looking for? There's all those phrases from one application to now on iHeart, Podomatic, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play, and always adding more. But I think with the podcast, how many times, I was telling my manager on the way up here, how many wrestling stories are there to tell? If we want to talk about Monday Night Raw, we can tell 5, 10, 20 stories about Raw, and they're all going to be pretty much the same because we're all watching the same show. And so if you listen to Steve Austin's podcast talking about Raw, and then you listen to Taz's podcast talking about Raw, and then you listen to Chris Jericho on Westwood One talking about Raw, and then you listen to Colt Cabana talking about Raw. How many stories can you really hear, or different takes on a story can you hear about Raw before it starts to get, I've already heard this, I already heard that, And so to me, what sets Taz's apart is that Taz talks a lot about sports on top of it. Jericho talks a lot about entertainment and music on top of it because of his connection through Fozzy. Austin talks about entertainment in general, movies, and intersperses that, like pop culture, with his. And with ours, as hot of a topic as politics is in America today, and I think worldwide because of Trump, that it's a really unique place that you can go for wrestling fans. I've often found a lot of wrestling fans, so many people think wrestling fans are, they just like wrestling and not much else. And my experience over my career has been that I've met some damn intelligent wrestling fans and fans of, like any segment, wide variation of likes and dislikes. And I have a lot of people since the podcast coming up and saying, hey, I love the podcast, or hey, I disagree with you on this point, Shane, or hey, Shane, I think get your head up your ass on that point. But like I've often said in my career, talk good about me or talk bad about me. Muhammad Ali was so successful because half the crowd wanted to see him win and the other half wanted to see him get his ass kicked. But everybody had an opinion. In wrestling, I've tried to do the same thing with far less success than Muhammad Ali. But in politics, everybody has an opinion. You love it, you hate it, you love him or her, you hate him or her. Everybody has an opinion. So why be, Austin to Taz to Colt Cabana to or Jericho to? Let's be the Triple Threat podcast and be completely separate and different than anybody.
And I believe you have a Twitter address.
Yeah, the Franchise SD, # Franchise SD. The podcast can be accessed through the 2-Man Power Trip of Wrestling on iTunes. Just go to their site and then click down. It's 2 buttons. Click on that. Scroll down. First one comes up is Triple Threat Podcast. Click on it. We continue to grow it out, and starting to look for in discussions into talking to like CBS Radio, to iHeartRadio, to Westwood One Radio, and other outlets out there to possibly take it to a wider syndication around the country. When I talk about things in politics, so the fans understand, this isn't just Shane Douglas's opinion. I read the paper today, and I'm going to give you my opinion on something. I've gone through and done, first of all, spent my entire educational life learning this stuff from the time I was in 6th grade through my 2 master's equivalencies, and taught it for 7 years. Follow it, and when any topic that comes up, we get the itinerary for the week based on things the 3 of us, me and my co-host Chad and John Pozowski, that we we kick ideas. What do you think about this? And we finally craft what the itinerary will be. I go through and make sure I do hours of research on those political topics I'm going to talk about. This isn't just my opinion spewing off like current events in history class. It's well researched and not just my opinion. It's based off what I'm doing, finding my research. So I think the next big thing for the podcast is that we've been kicking around the ideas, and it's just a bit of engineering hurdles that have to be gotten over, is to have either call-in guests or guests that we bring on the show, be it Francine or Taz or Steve Austin, to get their input on these things as well. But we're always looking at ways to improve the podcast. And we're only going to episode 33, so it hasn't been around for a million years, and we've been stuck on one format. We've changed up. We have sporadically throughout the 33-week run, we've had individual topics per show. One was on the Gary Wolf broken neck angle. Another was on this just past episode 32 was on the Guilty as Charged 99 with angle with Taz, the epic angle and build up for that year with Taz. And we have a segment called AFA Ask Franchise Anything, where the fans can send in to, and make sure I get these right because they're a little bit hard, hashtag the 3 threat pod or the triple threat pod at gmail.com. The fans will send in their questions there, and John Paz will go through and he'll look and say, well, segment 3 we're going to be talking about Trump doing this, and here's a great question that relates to that, and he'll plug those in, and so it sort of seamlessly flows together. It's been a lot of fun for me, and it's something that's obviously I'm very passionate about, and I think from the feedback I'm getting on Twitter and Facebook, there's a lot of fans out there that have the same type of connection to it, and a lot of people that really enjoy it. So we're going to keep crafting it and working on that and see how we can hunt it down to make it even better.
Well, I'll wish you the best of luck with that, and again, I hope to maybe do a part 2 with you in the future.
Love to.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
I'm a little bit verbose in my career, so we'll get them and nail the rest out for you.
Excellent.
Appreciate it. Good seeing everybody.
This is Hannibal from thehannibaltv.com, and today on the line for the Great North Wrestling Podcast, we have former Canadian champion, unfortunately I have to say that, but I did win the title back from him, I will say that, and also the reigning and first ever Great North Wrestling World Television Champion, and I know he's had some successful title defenses lately. He is the nephew of Jack Briscoe and the son of Jerry Briscoe, Wes Briscoe.
What's going on, Hannibal?
What's going on? I'm still freezing out here training in the cold when I'm running outside, while you're lucky enough to be in the nice climate of Florida right now.
Oh man, I'm sitting on the beach drinking a margarita right now.
Well, I'm glad you're relaxing because you have a pretty big title defense coming up May 12th in Brockville, Ontario, and it's going to be in a mixed martial arts cage. You're going to be facing the 6'6"
350-pound prodigy Nathan Banner, who you have had a match with in Great North Wrestling before, and I think, what was it, you won one fall, he won a fall, and it was ultimately ruled a draw or something like that?
Man, there's no draws when I wrestle. You know I came out with the W.
But apparently the Great North Wrestling Championship Committee has ruled that he had a recent victory over Scorpio and a couple other big victories, so they've ruled that he's now the #1 contender for this world television title. So how are you preparing for this match inside of a cage?
Well, first of all, we know that committee is all messed up right now. And you know what? I'm a fighting champion. And, you know, as the TV champion right now, I will defend it against anybody. And if Nathan really, really earned that spot, then he's more than welcome to step in that cage with me. It's not the first time I stepped in a cage, and it won't be my last time stepping into a cage.
Now, this is going to be more of a MMA-style match than you're used to. It's not going to be really your traditional pro wrestling match. Do you think you'll have an advantage in this style of match with your amateur wrestling background?
Yeah, definitely. Don't forget, you know, I'm a 2-time state champion. I also have 2 different black belts, and I also did boxing as an amateur. So, you know, I'm not really scared to step in that cage, put in the gloves, or do whatever I have to do just to keep that TV championship, because I'm going to do whatever it takes to walk out of that ring, #1. Actually, walk out of that cage, #1.
2 different black belts. May I ask what those are in?
I did one in Muay Thai and one in Taekwondo.
Very interesting. I was not aware of that.
I spent 14 years doing it.
And you actually won a match in Rockland last year prior to winning the 25-man Battle Royal to become the World Television Champion. But something interesting happened in that Battle Royal, and it seemed like the fans were actually cheering for you to win the Battle Royal, which is very unusual. Can you explain why this might be happening all of a sudden?
Well, I think the fans are finally seeing my hard work, finally seeing my passion, finally seeing that I'm not just going to let the aces and eights, I'm not just going to let Jason dictate my match. I'm going to actually go out there and give it my all, put my heart out there, put my tears out there, put my blood out there, and be the real TV champion, which I'm destined to be.
And speaking of your heart, there seems to be a bit of more than just a managerial relationship with this Valentine. What's going on with you guys? Is she just your manager, or what's happening? I saw the kiss after you won the title.
Oh, you know, it's just a kiss. I mean, we'll keep that separate. We'll see what plays out in the future. But, you know, of course, you know, West Briscoe always kind of stay single, you know. Kind of a ladies' man, and I love the ladies. So we'll see where that goes, you know. Let's just take it one step at a time, and let's just worry about Nathan right now and worry about my love life another time.
And I was reading on the internet, you won the award for Cauliflower Alley Futures Legends Award a few years ago. We're actually going to be covering the Cauliflower Alley event this year for the Hannibal TV, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are on winning that award a couple years ago. That's a pretty big deal.
You know, that award was actually a really big deal, and I didn't have any clue that I was actually winning. They actually told me by surprise and snuck me in and said I have to watch my dad get some awards. So I went and sat at the dinner, and I was totally surprised when they called my name up. And it was truly a honor and a great night. And I'm truly blessed to be able to get that award. And, you know, it means the world to me. And hopefully, you know, I'll live up to that being a future legend.
Well, it looked like you were going to be signed by WWE again, possibly last year. I know you had a tryout at the Performance Center. They even posted some pictures of your tryout on the website. Did you ever get any feedback on what happened with that tryout?
No, everything went really well, and then I had kind of like a freak accident, and I had to, you know, kind of fix up my knee a little bit. So I just kind of took some time off to, you know, heal up some old injuries and make sure I'm healthy 100%. So, you know, they never gave me a no, so just waiting for that call, you know. There's 100 people waiting in line, and hopefully, you know, I'm somewhere up on the top of that list.
Is there any favorite wrestler you have right now in that company? Someone that you would like to possibly wrestle if you were to get a job back in WWE in the future?
Randy Orton was one of the guys that I would always, want to face, just because I just love his style. I love how great he is in the ring. And then also Finn Balor is another one, and Seth Rollins. Those are, some of the guys that I would love to get in there with.
And with your uncle being a former NWA champion and your dad being really well known as an NWA legend, what are your thoughts on all this stuff happening with Billy Corgan trying to get the NWA title over again and everything that's going on with that?
I hope it works out, and from what I heard, he really wants to make it like the old school way, and I hope it works out. I always wish every company the best, because you want to see every company succeed, because that means more jobs for every wrestler.
And you've had some matches for New Japan. You've traveled all over the UK. You've been in Puerto Rico. I know Great North Wrestling is one of your bases now, but is there any other place that you've been wrestling on a regular basis?
All over the place, man. I can't keep track. I'm in Detroit next week, and then from Detroit I fly straight to Colorado. I'm pretty much all over the place. I love going to different cities, and I love getting to show the fans, what I'm capable of doing. And especially I love Canada. Great North Wrestling is definitely the spot to be, and I love all the fans out there, and I love the appreciation that they're showing me, and hopefully I can keep being their TV champion and representing them in a good way.
And you're very well known for your time in TNA. They gave you a big push there with the Aces and Eights. It's now known as Impact Wrestling. They've done some tapings in Canada recently that I was on, but they're also back recording in Orlando. With this new management here and this kind of non-exclusive contracts that they're doing, would you be interested in the future of working for them again in some capacity?
Man, anybody that pays me, I'll step in that ring again. So I don't really matter what company it is, as long as the money's good, I'm down.
Is there any type of training you're doing specifically to fight this Nathan Banner, who's, I know you've had matches with me and some bigger guys, but this guy weighs a lot, 350 pounds. He's a big boy, so...
Yeah, I just been powerlifting, amateur wrestling, and boxing. Trying to box as much as I can, and getting that cardio up, because even though he's 6'6", 300 pounds, I feel like I can out-cardio him and out-move him in the ring.
Where can fans follow you on social media that are listening to this?
They can follow me at West Briscoe 19 on Instagram, and then they can also follow me on Twitter at West Briscoe, the one with the blue check.
And what's your message for Nathan Banner? I know he's going to be listening to this.
You know what, Nathan? We've had our struggles before. Apparently, you've had one up on me. I got one up on you. And I know right now you're the #1 contender. And hopefully you're training, because I'm training. Even though I'm sitting on the beach right now drinking a pina colada, looking at these girls walk by, I'm thinking about you, man. Me and you, it's going down. So get ready. Can't wait to see you in that cage, buddy.
And all I can say is you're lucky that I have to fight Haku on this show, and then I got to get revenge on Quebecer Pierre. But after I'm done settling those disputes, if you somehow manage to slip by Banner, I'll be going after that title.
You know what, Hannibal? Bring it. I always, we've had our really tough feuds before, but you know what? You're always someone that I do truly respect. And you know what? If I make it past Banner, which I will, come on up.